The lords and ladies of Westeros had gathered in the scorched ruins of the dragon pit, each of them still unsettled by the lingering tang of ash in the air and the long shadows cast by the day's grim proceedings. The Destruction King's landing had endured lay heavy upon them, and the weight of the realm's future pressed upon every heart present. Tyrion Lannister stood amid the group with his shoulders squared but his spirit trembling, as though the ghosts of every mistake and tragedy dangled from him like chains. He cleared his throat in the hush that followed Grey Worm's final demand for justice. They had come together to choose a ruler, to decide once and for all who would sit the Iron Throne, though the Iron Throne itself was melted and gone, leaving only the question of who would guide the Seven Kingdoms from that day onward. In that storied place, however, something unexpected rippled through the gathering. When Tyrion turned to Bran Stark and delivered his persuasive words, naming Bran as the one who could hold the realm together after so many horrors, Bran listened with those remote, all-seeing eyes. He was silent a heartbeat longer than any soul anticipated. And in that prolonged pause, as though the entire realm held its breath, Bran Stark, Bran the Broken, the boy who became the three-eyed raven, finally spoke. But what he said changed everything. "No," Bran said, his voice quiet yet steady as stone, the single syllable bringing the council to a standstill. The hush that followed was almost painful. The breeze carried the crackle of broken stone underfoot and the distant, guttural caw of crows circling overhead. Sansa Stark blinked in confusion, Arya's lips parted slightly. Ser Davos furrowed his brow and Gendry shifted his weight from one foot to the other. Tyrion himself felt his tongue cleave to the roof of his mouth. Then, as if they needed more certainty, Bran spoke again, clarifying his meaning. "I will not take the throne. I cannot. You have brought me here to decide the future of the realm, but I see how the paths unfold. And in every vision I am meant to guide, but never to rule. I am, apart from the world of crowns. I do not belong upon a throne." The gathered lords and ladies exchanged questioning, alarmed glances, as though this refusal might plunge them anew into chaos. Grey Worm's stern face hardened and the unsullied around him shifted. Had they not needed swift resolution, had the realm not needed leadership that very moment, perhaps the tension would have flared into violence. Yet Tyrion drew a breath. He struggled with the words to say, not comprehending how their meticulously chosen new king could unravel that plan in only a moment. He turned slightly, leveling a gaze at Sansa, who looked stricken at her brother's words. Yet Sansa also recognized something in the lines of Bran's face. Perhaps, after all the nights she had stayed awake in Winterfell, after all she had witnessed, she knew that when Bran spoke with such finality, there was no budging him. "This is unexpected," Tyrion murmured, trying to make sense of it. "Bran, do you understand what's at stake here? We have the chance to forge a new future. You have the ability to, eh?" Bran closed his eyes for a moment, those milky orbs giving the impression that he was gazing inward. "I know the weight of the choice, and I see that the realm needs someone to guide it, but I cannot be that person. My place is to keep the memories of our world, not to become a symbol for it. I have witnessed too much to tie myself to mortal power." His words might have sounded cryptic. Indeed, they were cryptic, but they came from a place deeper than politics. The lords and ladies, who had come with the expectation of a quick solution, now looked to one another in confusion. Samwell Tarly swallowed, pushing aside the memory of how he had suggested something akin to democracy earlier, only to be laughed at. Davos ran a hand over his trimmed gray beard, searching for a stable anchor in the conversation. Grey Worm's posture stiffened. "The Northman was your choice," he said curtly, addressing Tyrion. "If he won't accept, what now? We do not have time for 1,000 days of squabbling while your queen's killer languishes in chains." Tyrion's eyes darted from face to face. They could not simply pick another name out of thin air. The realm was on the verge of disintegration. Chaos beckoned from the edges, like a predator waiting to pounce. He stepped forward and held up a hand. "We must not let one refusal undo everything. My lords, my ladies, let us think on this anew. We are gathered here in good faith, are we not? To prevent further bloodshed?" A murmur of assent rumbled softly through the crowd. Then Tyrion looked at Bran with pleading eyes. "If not you, then who, Bran? We need an answer, or we risk losing what little stability we have. Will you guide us in that choice, at least?" For several seconds, Bran did not answer. And in the hush, the weight of all their hopes balanced precariously. Finally, Bran's voice rolled across the broken stones. "I can help you choose, but the burden of the crown belongs to one who still lives fully in this world, who can move hearts not by the mysteries of the past, but by a strength anchored in the present." The tension in the circle of onlookers began to ease, if only because they sensed some resolution might still be possible. Sansa's face was pale, but her spine remained rigid. She pressed her lips together in a tight line. Others studied her expression, wondering if she might emerge as the next candidate. She had already made her claim on the North's independence in the line of conversation that led to Bran's near acclamation. Arya, for her part, looked restless, almost impatient with the entire notion of monarchy, yet her gaze constantly flicked to her brother. Tyrion exhaled a shaky breath. "And do you have someone in mind? Someone who can do the job well?" He dared not appear too eager, but the question was rhetorical, for in his heart, Tyrion already suspected who that person might be. Bran's insight could point them to a name that none of them anticipated. Or it could point to Sansa Stark. Or perhaps, though Tyrion doubted it, it might land on Tyrion himself. The notion frightened him more than he cared to admit. Bran's eyes roamed across the gathering. "The realm is fragile," he said gently. "It must be someone beloved, someone who has championed the interests of the people and who has also witnessed our darkest days. Someone who carries the memory of loss so that loss may not be repeated." His gaze alighted on Tyrion then, and for a moment Tyrion's heart seized. But Bran's gaze slipped on, moving across the crowd to rest on another figure. The realm needs a protector, not a conqueror. Everyone followed Bran's line of sight. It came to rest at last on Ser Davos Seaworth, who stiffened in surprise. Davos's mouth fell half open, and he glanced around as if expecting someone else to be behind him. A humble smuggler turned hand of a king he had never imagined wearing a crown or bearing regal titles. "Me," he croaked, clearing his throat. "Now, hold on just a moment, that can't be right." He turned and saw, to his alarm, that a few of the lords present wore thoughtful expressions. Tyrion, for one, found the idea quietly appealing. Davos had always had a compassionate heart and a sense of justice that wasn't anchored in birthright but in doing what was good and honorable. If that was the counsel of the three-eyed raven, Bran's counsel, then perhaps there was sense to it. Davos had never sought power, which, in Tyrion's mind, made him a better candidate than most. But then a new clamor rose. Yara Greyjoy frowned, the wheels of her mind churning. Robin Arryn, tall and lean now though still awkward in posture, shifted uncomfortably, uncertain how to respond. Gendry stepped forward slightly, his jaw set. He had come here not to press a claim, but to stand for House Baratheon as the new Lord of Storm's End. This was all unexpected. "This is not I am no king," Davos continued, a tremor in his voice. "What do I know of ruling? I've only ever tried to do what was right by the poor folk and the good men who deserve better." He looked to Tyrion as though seeking rescue from this predicament. Yet Tyrion seemed more thoughtful than dismissive. "And perhaps that is precisely why you're a better choice than most of us. You helped unify the North and Daenerys' forces. You tried to broker peace. You managed to keep common sense in the face of fanaticism. If the realm needs a wise, humble ruler, well, you do have some of those qualities in abundance." Davos shook his head. "This is madness," he muttered. But the more he protested, the more it seemed to resonate with the crowd that he was no typical lord. The memory of King Stannis' ill-fated war still clung to Davos like an echo. Yet that shadow made him neither cruel nor corrupt. Davos had always served, as best he could, something greater than himself. A just cause, a righteous king or queen. Could it be he was the one they needed now? Sansa's expression relaxed slightly, as though this twist of fate might allow her a graceful solution for the North. Arya kept her silence, only drifting closer to her siblings. Grey Worm gave a curt shake of his head. "What do we do with the Kingslayer's brother and the one who killed our queen?" he demanded, keeping them on track. "I will not wait forever." Tyrion inclined his head. "Let us decide on our ruler first. Then the question of Jon Snow and any other matters will follow." Davos gulped, feeling the gazes of countless important figures upon him, and turned to Bran. "Are you certain about this, lad? You see things, I know. But am I truly the one to lead us out of this wreckage?" Bran's mild expression did not change. "I can see many paths, and if I were to try to lead in truth, I would fail to remain impartial. You, however, have the humility to learn and the capacity to hear counsel. But this is your choice as well. You must accept if you will." Davos rubbed his weathered hands over his face. Images of the flea-bottom children came to him, the hungry peasants he had tried to feed with bowls of brown stew, the families displaced by the war. He found himself picturing them with an ache in his heart. Those same families who needed some small beacon of hope. Could he, Davos Seaworth, do that? Could he speak for them at the highest seat of power? "It would be a farce for a smuggler to sit a throne," he said at last, his voice hushed and thick. But there've been worse kings, I suppose. Far worse. And I do love this bloody realm, though she's seldom loved me back. Tyrion raised his voice. Does anyone here contest Ser Davos Seaworth as King of the Undulls and the First Men, Lord of the Six Kingdoms? He glanced at Sansa then, as if to acknowledge the North's separate destiny that might arise. No one immediately raised a hand in protest. Some had uncertain expressions, but the prospect of Davos was better than an endless war of succession. Yara Greyjoy, for her part, looked put out, but she did not argue. Gendry was simply stunned. The Prince of Dorne, a new, younger man, remained silent but not overtly opposed. When Sansa spoke, her voice wavered slightly but held conviction. The North has bled enough. The North deserves its independence, as has been our desire. If Ser Davos is to be our king in the South, then the North shall remain free. Winterfell shall be its own kingdom under my rule. At that, the corners of her mouth curved in a sad but resolute line. She cast a final glance at Bran as though still grappling with his decision, but she accepted it. Davos looked over at Sansa, who was poised and regal in her bearing. "Aye, Lady Sansa," he said. "I understand your cause. The North has endured so much. As king, as your neighbor, if that's what I am to be, I only ask we stand in friendship." Sansa dipped her head respectfully, and thus it was settled with a surprising lack of bloodshed or acrimony. Davos Seaworth, by the will of that unlikely council, would serve as king of the Six Kingdoms while Sansa Stark reigned as queen in the North. A hush hung as though the world itself needed a moment to digest this shift. Now Grey Worm stalked forward, glaring at Tyrion. "What of Jon Snow?" His voice resonated with the fury of a man who had lost nearly everything. "He killed our queen." Tyrion grimaced. The new king must decide his fate. Then he looked at Davos. "Your Grace, what say you?" The words "Your Grace" seemed to startle Davos, whose brow furrowed. He shot a glance at Bran, almost as if seeking rescue, but found none. So he straightened. "Summon him," Davos said softly. "We must hear his side just as well." In truth, the entire realm knew what had happened. The tale would be told and retold for generations. But there, in that uneasy hush, no one disagreed. Grey Worm signaled to the Unsullied. Moments later, they marched away to fetch Jon Snow from his captivity. Tyrion let out a breath he had not realized he was holding. I think it would be good if we adjourn for a short while, let his grace gather his thoughts." He gave Davos an apologetic nod. Being made king on the spot can be overwhelming. At that, a fragile note of humor rippled through the group like a sigh of relief. The lords and ladies, battered by war and heartbreak, needed this faint taste of normalcy, a chance to breathe. Davos nodded, swallowing the lump in his throat. I need to find my feet." And he cast a last glance to Bran. "Thank you for your guidance." But Bran only closed his eyes, letting the swirl of mortal concerns drift around him while he soared in an airy realm of ravens and half-forgotten memories. Jon Snow emerged under unsullied guard, his expression hollow, his hair matted, and the lines of exhaustion etched deep on his face. The cluster of lords and ladies reassembled in the dragon pit with subdued gravity, forming a semicircle before the newly anointed King Davos. Jon's wrists bore no shackles, but the presence of armed men around him spoke volumes. He looked from Tyrion to Davos and finally settled his gaze on Bran, who watched from Sansa's side. Everything about Bran had changed since their last fleeting meeting. Yet Jon's immediate concern was, of course, the question of his fate. "Jon Snow," Davos began, his voice sounding strangely authoritative, though uncertainty wavered beneath. "You stand accused of killing Daenerys Targaryen, the Dragon Queen. She was your queen, by your own oath, but you ended her life. We know your reasons, but the realm demands to understand." "I demand to understand." Jon's eyes flickered with pain. "If you need a reason, look at what she did in King's Landing. Look at the ashes. I never wanted to, but she had to be stopped." His voice cracked. He remembered the tears on Daenerys' cheeks, the heartbreak in her eyes, and the resolute frenzy that had driven her to incinerate thousands. There was no other way. Grey Worm sneered, but Davos raised a hand to keep the peace. We all know the city burned. Many innocents died. She was poised to conquer the rest of the world, perhaps shedding more blood on the way. Some of us understand. But the realm cries out for justice too. Justice for all who died. They do not want to see more slaughter." Davos paused. "What do you propose be done with you, Jon Snow?" A spark of sorrow flashed in Jon's dark eyes. "I came into this world as a bastard of House Stark, or so I believed. I fought for the living in the Great War. I tried to uphold my vows, but I was torn between them. His breath caught. If you see fit to punish me, I won't resist. I've had enough of all of this. Whispers moved through the gathering. Targaryen blood, he's the rightful heir, and so on. But no one spoke it openly just yet. The rightful heir or no, the realm had chosen a king, and that king was neither Jon nor his Targaryen aunt. Davos exchanged a long look with Tyrion. Perhaps the simplest route was to banish Jon. The Night's Watch had once been a place for exiles and men who needed a new start. But the wall was in ruins and the threat from beyond was all but vanquished. Yet it was Tyrion who gently broke the silence. We stand on the precipice of a new age. The Iron Throne no longer exists, melted away by dragon fire. Our new king, chosen by the will of this council, has a duty to unite the realm and move beyond vengeance. Let us not forget the real war that was fought for the survival of humankind. Jon Snow was a hero in that war. In simpler times, we might let him go free. In more complicated times, men might call for his head. Tyrion's voice grew soft. But times are complicated and we still need peace. Davos nodded slowly. I cannot in good conscience order your execution, Jon. You ended one tyranny to prevent a worse one. But I cannot let you walk free in the streets of King's Landing either. Grey Worm's men won't stand for that, and many in the realm would see it as a betrayal of justice. He sighed. What would serve the realm best is to set you aside from these power struggles. Jon waited, his face a mask of resignation. Then send me to the Night's Watch, he said, without bitterness. Let me spend the rest of my days there, beyond these wars and crowns. My watch can begin anew. It was a half-formed notion, but it lit a glimmer in Davos's eyes. Aye, that might be best. If the wall stands, or if the Night's Watch can be rebuilt, you can do some good there, maybe. Keep your vows, or some version of them. Grey Worm stiffened, but after a moment he nodded curtly. Tyrion observed with sadness. The Night's Watch. The realm can live with that. Let him father no children, hold no lands, wear no crown. That is punishment enough, I think. Jon bowed his head, neither relieved nor resentful, merely tired. Davos's posture softened. So be it. You'll leave as soon as possible. May the gods grant you peace. Then Davos hesitated, the reality of being the final voice on such matters unsettling. We'll provide you supplies and escort. You should gather your things. Thank you, Jon said with quiet sincerity. In that moment, the weight he had carried for so long pressed in on him, but there was also a faint sense of release. In the crowd, Sansa watched him with sorrow. She wanted to protest, to keep him in the north with her as family. But the memory of the devastation wrought by Daenerys's final choice dulled her protests. It was necessary for the sake of unity. And so, after everything, Jon would go beyond the politics, beyond the battered city, and find what fragments of peace might exist on the fringes of the known world. With the key questions of the day settled, Bran Stark's refusal of the throne, Ser Davos's acceptance, the North's independence, and Jon's exile, the lords and ladies began to filter from the Dragonette. Grey Worm soon departed, leading the Unsullied to the ships that would bear them across the sea, to Noth or wherever they might find solace. Perhaps a kinder destiny awaited them there. Tyrion was left with a swirl of conflicting feelings. He had expected to become Hand again, or some other role, but he also harbored guilt for his part in Daenerys's rise and subsequent fall. Davos, as the new king, would need all the help he could get. So it was no surprise when, hours later, Davos summoned Tyrion and asked him to serve as Hand of the King. The realm's well-known watchers and whisperers might have predicted this outcome, and for good reason. But standing in what remained of the Red Keep, in a battered chamber that once belonged to Cersei or some other occupant of the fortress, Tyrion hesitated, looking at Davos, who wore a circlet of gold crafted hastily by the city's remaining blacksmiths. "Your Grace," Tyrion began, the words feeling strange. I have committed many errors. Wouldn't you prefer someone with a purer record?" Davos shook his head. "I need someone wise enough to spot pitfalls, and contrite enough to regret past mistakes. You're the best I've got for that, Tyrion. The realm needs stability. Will you help me make it so?" Tyrion exhaled. Despite the smoldering ruin around them, he felt a flicker of hope. Maybe, just maybe, they could do better this time. He bowed. "I accept." Winter fell behind them as Jon made the lonely journey north. He traveled on horseback through the charred remains of the Crownlands, skirting the edges of battered villages. He was accompanied by only a small escort of soldiers under Davos's banner, a newly sewn sigil showing a golden stag and a black ship, a nod to the new king's history as a smuggler and the Baratheon lineage of the throne he now occupied. They avoided crowds. Jon did not want to be recognized, and neither did the soldiers wish to rouse the anger of those still loyal to the Targaryen cause. Sparse though such pockets were, vengeance could burn hot. Part of Jon felt numb. How many times had he ridden north? From the moment he left Winterfell as a younger man to join the Night's Watch the first time, to the ride with Daenerys' army to fight the Night King, he had always found himself drawn inexorably back to the land of ice and cold winds. His watch would never truly end, it seemed. They passed Moat Cailin with little incident, the old ruins looming like silent sentinels over the causeway. Before long, the escort brought him to Winterfell, if only briefly, for he was determined to press on to the wall. Sansa met him at the gates, her hair woven in a single fiery braid that draped over her furs. The hush of the courtyard was heavy with emotion, and those loyal to House Stark bowed or curtsied in deference to the new queen in the north. Jon dismounted and approached her, his heart twisting with longing for a simpler time. "Your Grace," Jon said softly, the faintest hint of a rueful smile on his lips. Sansa's eyes glistened. "Don't call me that. You're my brother, Jon." Jon's response was almost a whisper. "Half-brother, cousin, however they want to name it. But we're family, Sansa. That won't change." She embraced him tightly, ignoring any courtly decorum. For a few moments, the crushing sense of duty, the heartbreak, the bitterness of war, melted away. "I'm so sorry," she whispered, "for everything." He closed his eyes. It's all right. But they both knew nothing was all right. It might never be. They had lost too much. And in a few days, he would leave again for Castle Black, or what remained of it. The idea that so many had died in the wars, only for them to scatter once more, was an ache they shared. Over the course of that day and the next, Sansa insisted he rest in Winterfell. He walked the courtyard, recalling childhood days, visited the crypts to pay respects to Ned Stark, Catelyn, and the others who had passed. Ghost roamed by his side, that faithful white dire wolf who had survived the battles and latched onto Jon's presence again. Time was fleeting, but it was enough to glean a small measure of comfort. A sense that in this place he was known and accepted. Sansa made her vow to guard the North's independence for as long as she ruled, and Jon believed she was more than capable. She was not the same fearful girl that left King's Landing in tears so many years ago. She had become a queen in more ways than one. Some of the northern lords eyed Jon with a complicated reverence. He was once king in the north, after all, and they would have welcomed him back. But none challenged Sansa. She had their loyalty, and Jon had chosen his path, or rather, his path had chosen him. On the evening before his departure, they dined together in the Great Hall. It was a subdued meal, quiet conversation drifting over bowls of stew and fresh bread. Arya was gone, sailing west of Westeros as she had insisted. Bran had remained in Winterfell for a time before departing again on journeys only he understood, though he told Sansa he would stay close. The notion of close was vague, given Bran's unique abilities. Still, the hall felt emptier without them all. Sansa asked if Jon needed anything special for the road, but he shook his head. "I'll have what I need," he said, gently patting the thick cloak he wore. They spoke of the future. Sansa expressed hope that with Davos as king, there might be a real chance for peace, especially if Tyrion navigated the politics with his usual cunning. Jon offered a small, sad smile. "I trust Davos. He's a good man, and Tyrion knows enough mistakes to avoid." He paused. "Just be careful, Sansa. Ruling can be lonely." She nodded, pressing her lips together. "I know. But I've learned from the worst, and I have my people around me. I'll manage. And if you ever need anything, come home. The North will always be your home, no matter what vow you're under." His throat felt tight. "Thank you." He wanted to say more about the regrets that haunted him, about the nights he woke in a cold sweat, remembering Daenerys' last breath and the terrible finality of what he had done. But the words wouldn't come. Instead, he squeezed her hand as though trying to convey the weight of his gratitude. By the next dawn, he left Winterfell behind once more, riding into the biting wind, heading for Castle Black, Ghost at his side. He did not look back, for fear that doing so would break him entirely. In King's Landing, reconstruction began in earnest. Buildings lay collapsed in heaps of scorched timber and stone, entire blocks were reduced to ash, and the stench of death still lingered in the corners of the city where bodies had yet to be properly buried. But with a new king on the throne, a calmer atmosphere had settled. Ser Davos Seaworth, the first of his name, made it his mission to help the small folk before any other matter of state. He dispatched royal decrees that the crown would pay laborers who cleared rubble and rebuilt homes, that food from the surrounding lands should be brought into the city for distribution, and that certain taxes would be suspended until the city could function again. Although resources were limited and the crown's coffers had been drained by war, there was a collective sense of relief among the people who had grown weary of violence. Davos had always cared about the common man, and it showed in his earliest decisions. Tyrion Lannister, as Hand of the King, set to work in a refurbished tower of the Red Keep that had somehow survived the dragon's wrath. He spent his days drafting letters, negotiating with whichever lords or ladies arrived seeking audience, and offering counsel to Davos. The new king's reliance on Tyrion was significant. He recognized that he had no taste for backroom deals or elaborate court intrigues, and Tyrion thrived in that domain. Together, they presented a united front of decency and practicality. The small council soon formed around them, with Samwell Tarly as Grand Maester, Brienne of Tarth as Lord Commander of the King's Guard, though the official title still took getting used to for her, and a reluctant Gendry Baratheon serving as Master of Ships. On a warm afternoon, not long after the Great Council in the Dragon Pit, Tyrion and Davos met in a small solar overlooking the city. King's Landing was a patchwork of ruin and recovery below them, dust rising from the busied streets. Davos leaned on the windowsill, his fingers rubbing absently at the nail of his missing fingertips, a habit Tyrion recognized as an old tic. "My lord, your grace," Tyrion said, correcting himself. He offered a small wry smile. "I've news from the Reach. The Tyrell line is extinguished, but the lords who hold the territories still bicker among themselves for control of Highgarden. We must settle that if we want the grain shipments to flow properly." Davos sighed. "Always more squabbling, isn't it? I'd have never believed how quickly they'd fight over the spoils. We'll have to pick a warden or confirm one. Did we not grant Highgarden to it?" "Bran," Tyrion said with a pained chuckle. "Yes, I do recall promising it to him under Queen Daenerys. And he'll likely appear to collect, though with Daenerys gone, the arrangement might be in question. Nonetheless, a promise is a promise, and he did help secure King's Landing with the Lannister forces for a time. He's a cunning sellsword, but at least we know what he wants: gold and comfort. He may be easier to manage than some highborn fanatic." Davos nodded. "Send for him. Let him stake his claim if that's what was promised. Then we'll see if he can handle the responsibility. Under normal circumstances, I'd balk at giving such a prize to a cutthroat, but these are hardly normal times." They fell into a companionable silence, each lost in thought. A swirl of dust motes danced in a beam of sunlight that slanted across the table. Tyrion swirled the wine in his cup, reflecting. "Your Grace, might I speak freely about a concern of mine?" "Always." Tyrion set down the cup. "You know we have many lords and ladies across the 6 kingdoms, each with their own ambitions. We've lost so many powerful families: Baratheon, Tyrell, Martell in part, Tully in part, and the old alliances are shattered. While you work on rebuilding, the seeds of future chaos are already being planted. For instance, the Iron Islands. Yara Greyjoy may yet decide to stand apart once more if she feels we're weak. And the new Prince of Dorne, well, we don't know how loyal he'll be once his power is secured. What I'm saying is, we need to cement some alliances. A marriage, perhaps." Davos frowned. "Me, you mean? Marriage at my age? My good wife Maria is gone these many years, and I've no taste for wedding again. Nevertheless, it might help unify the realm. If you married into a powerful house, we could tie that house's loyalty to the crown in a more permanent way." Tyrion paused, scanning Davos's expression. "You'd be free to choose whom you wish, of course. I'm not suggesting it lightly or for your enjoyment." Davos glanced at the battered city, remembering a time when politics were not his domain. I must think on it, Tyrion. My heart's not in it, that's the truth. But if it will help avoid more bloodshed, perhaps. For the good of the realm." He sighed heavily, pressing a hand to his brow. "Never would I have thought I'd be in this position. It's like I'm wearing boots several sizes too large, stumbling at every step." Tyrion's voice was soft. "Those are the best rulers, those who do not seek power. At least, that is what I keep telling myself, so I can sleep at night." Far to the north, Jon Snow arrived at Castle Black to find a fraction of what it once was. The looming walls were still formidable, but many sections had crumbled. The gates hung crooked, scorched by dragonfire from an earlier conflict, in a time that seemed like a half-forgotten dream. Only a small handful of black brothers remained, huddled in the vast, cold expanse of that ancient fortress. They greeted Jon with a mix of wariness and respect. After all, he was the man who had once led them, who had died for them and come back. And rumors persisted. Some said he was a Targaryen prince. But none of that mattered here, where the wind howled against the stone and the nights were cold beyond measure. Jon formally took the vows again, though in abbreviated fashion. There was no maester to oversee it, no grand ceremony. Just Jon, Ghost, and a few rangers who remained as stewards of duty. Felt strangely liberating. He no longer had illusions about the nobility of the Watch, nor the sense of idealistic purpose that had driven him in his youth. He simply found comfort in the monotony of daily chores, tending the horses, reinforcing the crumbling barricades, seeing that the men ate. Sometimes he would scout beyond the wall where the wildlings roamed freely. Tormund Giantsbane welcomed him as a brother. Together, they explored the endless white wilderness, forging a bond out of shared trials. Jon found something like solace in those icy expanses, free from the burden of lords and crowns. Yet at night, when he tried to sleep in the old commander's chamber that still smelled of dust and disuse, his mind churned with memories. Daenerys's tearful face, her eyes reflecting betrayal and heartbreak, that final moment as the knife slid into her. The roar of Drogon overhead. The touch of Ygritte's hand from years ago in a cave made warm by love. The voices of all those he had lost swirling around him. Some nights he woke drenched in sweat. Other nights he felt only numbness. But day after day the cold wind battered him, reminded him that the world was still turning. He was alive. That would have to suffice. One morning, as he stood atop the wall, gazing out at the tundra, he spotted a raven approaching. It landed on a nearby post, black wings fluttering against the icy wind. The bird cocked its head at him. For a moment, Jon could have sworn he sensed someone or something behind those eyes. Then it flew away, heading west, into a sky streaked with pale light. Jon wasn't certain if it was Bran or simply a raven. Either way, he whispered to himself, "Safe travels," and turned to descend the ancient steps. In the Red Keep, time pressed onward. Although much of the city remained under reconstruction, certain ceremonies could not be postponed. King Davos found himself standing in front of a small mirror wearing stately robes of deep blue lined with fur. His hair, peppered with gray, had been combed neatly, and a more finely wrought crown rested on his brow, this one hammered and shaped with greater care than the hastily made band from before. He looked at his reflection and shook his head. A king, truly, he muttered, the disbelief never fully leaving him. He stepped out into the corridor where Brienne of Tarth waited, resplendent in white cloak and gleaming armor. She bowed her head slightly out of respect, though the corners of her mouth betrayed a faint smile. "Your Grace," she said, "the throne room is ready." He nodded, exhaling. "Let's get this over with." The occasion was his official coronation. Though it had been decided in the Dragonette, many lords argued that a formal crowning in the Red Keep was necessary to solidify his reign. Tyrion had orchestrated the details, ensuring that the ceremony would be a modest affair in keeping with the realm's battered state, but still dignified enough to placate tradition. In the destroyed throne room, where once the Iron Throne had loomed, craftsmen had hastily arranged a simple wooden seat draped with Baratheon black and gold. It wasn't the melted swords of Aegon's conquest, but it served. A hush fell among the assembled lords and ladies, who wore somber expressions. They stood in lines, some bearing the fresh banners of their houses, some wearing the last remnants of garments that had survived the wars. Samwell Tarly, wearing the Grand Maester's chain that still seemed too large for his neck, stepped forward with a small tome in hand. He cleared his throat nervously, but a gentle nod from Davos seemed to reassure him. In a quavering voice, Sam read the ancient words that bound the king to protect the realm, to defend the weak, to uphold justice, and to put the good of the people first. The words echoed in the partly collapsed chamber, a testament to how far they had fallen from the days of pomp and grandeur. Tyrion stood to one side, his mismatched eyes watchful. When the moment came, he lifted the crown from a velvet cushion, a circlet of gold hammered with a sail and stag horns entwined, and placed it on Davos's brow. The hush in the chamber deepened, the gravity of the moment resonating in every witness's chest. "I present to you, Ser Davos of House Seaworth, King of the Six Kingdoms. May he reign wisely and well," Tyrion proclaimed, his voice carrying. Applause broke out, subdued but sincere. Davos inclined his head, swallowing hard. He had never wanted such power, but fate had placed it in his hands. The scars on his fingers tingled with the memory of how life had once been. When the formalities ended, Davos addressed the gathering. His words were earnest. He pledged to do his utmost to rebuild what war had destroyed, to seek peace with neighboring lands, and to rectify the wrongs that had been inflicted upon the small folk. He stated plainly that he would not tolerate further conquests or expansions. The realm had spilled enough blood. For a moment, in that hush, a flicker of hope warmed the battered hearts of those who listened. Perhaps at last they could look forward rather than constantly over their shoulders. Winterfell witnessed its own ceremony, albeit on a smaller scale, some weeks later. Sansa Stark had been declared queen in the north, but it had been done swiftly in the presence of the southern lords. Now she sought to gather her bannermen and women to reaffirm her position more traditionally among the northern houses. The courtyard was packed, the keep's battlements draped with dire wolf banners flapping in the wind. The chill was sharp in the air, but no one complained. They were northerners after all. Hundreds of men and women representing houses large and small thronged about. In front, Lady Brienne, who had traveled north for the occasion, stood alongside Podrick Payne. They had arrived on royal business but also to show solidarity with the new queen. Sansa wore a heavy cloak of gray wool trimmed in white fur, the Stark sigil embroidered on the back. Her hair was pinned in an intricate style reminiscent of her mother's, and the expression on her face was both resolute and solemn. She gazed out at her people, recalling how she had once been so eager to leave the north to live in King's Landing. How different the world looked now. Lyanna Mormont was gone, lost to the war against the dead, but representatives from Bear Island stood in her stead, bearing the small carved bear sigil. Lord Glover, after much hesitation, had come, ready to reaffirm his loyalties. The surviving Karstarks, Tallhearts, and Serwyns were arrayed, each paying respects to the daughter of Ned Stark. As Sansa surveyed them, her heart swelled with a sense of purpose and a flicker of grief for all who were absent. "Lords and ladies of the north," she began, her voice echoing in the brisk air. "We have endured the long night. We have endured wars that shook the foundations of Westeros. We have bled. We have lost. And yet we stand. We stand as northerners, proud and unbroken." A faint cheer rose, carried on a wind that whipped at cloaks and hair. "I will not pretend that our future is free of challenges," she continued. "But I promise you this, as queen in the north, I will put the welfare of our people above all else. No more shall we kneel to a distant throne that ignores our hardships. No more shall our sons and daughters be sacrificed for the ambitions of southern lords. We are the north and we are free." A rousing cry burst forth, the cold air filled with shouts of "the queen in the north," repeated again and again. It resonated against Winterfell's ancient walls, a fitting tribute to the old kings who had once ruled here. Tears prickled at the corners of Sansa's eyes, but she blinked them back. She could almost sense her father's presence, just out of sight, wearing the kind, proud smile he saved for his children. Yet she knew she had to be strong and wise, for her people looked to her now with deep reverence. After the acclamations quieted, she oversaw a great feast in the hall. Tables sagged under the weight of roasted boar, hearty stews, and bread from the last harvest, supplemented by supplies purchased with what little coin Winterfell had left. Meat and ale flowed, loosening tongues and warming bellies. She moved among her subjects with a quiet grace, exchanging words of comfort and hope. Many approached her with concerns: bandits roving the roads, a poor harvest in some region, the need for better trade routes. She took note of them all, promising to address each matter. Though she was queen, she did not distance herself from their worries. She lived among them, and they all felt the cost of the wars. Later in the evening, as the fires crackled and music started up, a mournful northern tune that grew more lively with each passing verse, Sansa found a moment to speak with Brienne. They stood near one of the great hearths, the amber glow dancing on their faces. Podrick sipped quietly on a mug of ale nearby. "I suppose you'll be returning to King's Landing soon," Sansa said. "The new king will have need of you. And my brother Tyrion too." Brienne inclined her head. "Yes, your grace. There is much to be done. But if you ever require assistance, the Kingsguard stands ready to help. I won't forget my vow to your mother to protect you." Sansa reached out and squeezed Brienne's hand. "You've done more than enough already, my lady. Thank you." She paused, searching Brienne's eyes. I want to ensure we stay on good terms with King Davos. The North is independent now, but we're still neighbors. We don't need more war. You'll tell him we stand ready to trade fairly, to help if any threat comes from the other continents. Let's forge an alliance based on respect, not subjugation." Brienne managed a smile. "I will. He's a good man. I believe he wants what you want, peace." Sansa nodded, hoping that was true. So many leaders had promised peace only to bring war. Yet she trusted Davos's character. His humility was a rarity among rulers. She lifted her gaze, taking in the swirl of merriment around them. Northerners drank and laughed, kids scampered underfoot, dogs barked for scraps, and the music thrummed with the beat of survival. A part of her yearned for Arya and Bran, for Jon, for her parents, for all of them to see this moment. She stood there wearing the mantle of queen and felt both pride and a tremor of loneliness in equal measure. Time moved on like a slow river winding through a scarred landscape, letting new growth sprout from the ashes. In King's Landing, entire neighborhoods began to resurrect, guided by the combined efforts of the crown and the local populace. Fields outside the city were replanted, though it would be some seasons before the harvest could fully sustain them. Refugees returned from hiding, nursing wounds of body and soul, but determined to rebuild. Hope was a fragile shoot, but one that grew stronger by the day. Within the Red Keep, Davos's daily routine was hectic. He held audiences, listened to petitions, mediated disputes between lords, and managed the realm's finances, an endless headache given how drained the treasury was. Tyrion provided cunning solutions, coaxing gold out of the Iron Bank in Braavos and persuading wealthy houses to invest in reconstruction, promising future returns once stability was assured. Sam Tarly busied himself with healing the city's sick, all while devouring ancient texts in search of any knowledge that could guide them toward a more enlightened rule. Brienne upheld the law, ensuring the few unscrupulous lords who tried to exploit the chaos were punished. Gendry oversaw the restoration of the royal fleet, an endeavor that also provided jobs for many unemployed carpenters and blacksmiths. Slowly, the battered city breathed anew. But no kingdom could exist without external diplomacy. Ravens flitted between King's Landing and the Iron Islands, forging a tenuous agreement with Yara Greyjoy, who insisted on near autonomy but grudgingly allowed that a stable realm was better than anarchy. Word came from Dorne that the new prince would acknowledge Davos's kingship, provided Dorne was granted significant self-governance and a seat of respect on the small council. Davos, with Tyrion's council, agreed to these terms, seeing no reason to provoke old grudges. And so, piece by piece, the realm knitted itself together in a patchwork of alliances. Yet not all were content. Whispers circulated about the Targaryen line. Some insisted Daenerys' son must be out there somewhere, a child of prophecy. Others murmured of the late Rhaegar Targaryen's rumored heirs or even Viserys' lineage. Conspiracy theories thrived in the taverns, stoked by those who believed a rightful dragon should reclaim the throne. Tyrion heard these rumors, but they rarely reached Davos's ears directly. When Tyrion brought it up, Davos waved it off. We can't chase every rumor. If there's truth in it, let them come forward. Until then, we have too much real work to do. Even so, Tyrion quietly kept an eye on such talk, mindful that a single spark of Targaryen loyalty could ignite civil strife. He had lived through enough chaos to respect how quickly flames could spread if given fuel. In the cold north, Jon Snow's life settled into a pattern of days that blurred together. He patrolled the lands beyond the Wall with Tormund, sometimes guiding small groups of free folk who wandered in search of better hunting grounds or safer shelter. If they encountered pockets of danger, ice wraiths, leftover necromancies, or just cruel weather, Jon did what he could to help, but mostly he found that the greatest enemy was the environment itself. The Night King was gone, the dead no longer rose in armies, and the free folk were content to live as they always had, by their own rules, with no king or queen but the harsh land. Jon admired that resilience. The old wooden structures of Castle Black creaked in the wind. The nights were long, the gloom broken only by torchlight. Each morning, he'd wake to a sky of pale gray, dress in furs, and continue the watch. The rest of the Black brothers numbered fewer than 50, a skeleton crew. Some were young criminals forced by southern lords to take the Black, others were orphans with nowhere else to go. Jon understood their cynicism. The glorious Night's Watch of Year was a tale told by old men. But here they were, carrying on the traditions because there was nothing else to do. Jon taught them how to fight, how to track, and how to survive. Perhaps that was enough. Sometimes, as he stood upon the wall, gazing out at the endless expanse of white, Jon felt a kind of peace. Other times, a desolation. He was no longer a king, no longer a hero, no longer entangled in the fate of the realm. He was simply a man paying penance, or perhaps living out the remainder of his days in a kind of self-imposed exile. Yet when he thought of the alternative, remaining in King's Landing or embroiling himself in further power struggles, he knew that despite the cold and the isolation, this was where he needed to be. Winter nights under the stars offered moments of stark beauty. Ghost would lie beside him, the direwolf's heat radiating through the chill. Jon would lift his eyes to the swirling constellations and think of his siblings scattered across the world. He hoped they were well. He hoped Sansa was safe, Arya was free, and Bran was content in his mysterious ways. Some nights he thought of them so intently, as though trying to send silent prayers across the distance, that he wondered if Bran could hear him. He had seen his brother, though brother was not quite the word, warg into ravens, gleaning knowledge from near and far. Perhaps, in some cosmic sense, their bond persisted. The thought gave him a measure of comfort. Seasons slipped by, though the lines between them had blurred since the unnatural long winters. In King's Landing, the seeds that had been planted after the war began to bear fruit, literally and figuratively. Harvest wagons arrived from the Reach, courtesy of Gendry's carefully negotiated treaties, and the city's population swelled again. Streets that had been deserted were repopulated, new craftsmen set up shops, and the hum of commerce returned. The Red Keep still bore scars of dragonfire, but repairs and improvements continued day by day. One afternoon, Tyrion was walking through the courtyard of the Red Keep with Podrick Payne, listening to the younger man's account of a minor dispute in the Stormlands. Tyrion's limp was more pronounced these days, the toll of old injuries and stress. Still, his mind was sharp and he was eager to address the day's tasks. Podrick spoke nervously of how one lord was accusing another of encroaching on farmland, but Tyrion's attention was diverted when he spotted a rider approaching through the main gate. It was Bran, swaggering in with his usual smirk. He wore fine leathers and sported a new doublet embroidered with a gold rose and a couple of coins, a mockery of the Tyrell and Lannister sigils combined. A broad grin split his face when he saw Tyrion. "Ah," the imp turned King's hand. "I hear you've got a castle and lands promised for me." He dismounted, tossing the reins to a stable boy. Tyrion sighed. "I was wondering when you'd show up." Bran shrugged. "I had business in the Westerlands first. Wine, women, the usual. But I'm here now, come to claim what's mine." Tyrion exchanged a glance with Podrick. "And what is it you think is yours, exactly?" "Highgarden," Bran said, pronouncing it with exaggerated flourish. "Nice ring to it, doesn't it? Lord of Highgarden, protector of the Reach, so on and so forth." Tyrion steeled himself. "Yes, well, that might be a bit complicated. You see, the regions had a power vacuum, and some of the lesser lords have staked their claims. We need them to agree to your authority, or we risk conflict." Bran rolled his eyes. "So convince them. Or you could convince them," Tyrion said, arching a brow. "You're the one who wants to be their lord. I'm certain your diplomatic skills will come in handy." Bran's laugh was rough. "Oh, I'll convince them all right. Nothing a show of steel and a few bags of coin can't fix. Just make sure I have the crown's backing, yeah? I'd hate to ride down there and find out the kings had a change of heart." At that moment, King Davos himself strolled into the courtyard, flanked by guards. Upon seeing Bran, he paused, nodded politely. "So you're the man Tyrion told me about, Bran." Bran gave a casual bow. "The one and only Your Grace." Davos's keen eyes took in Bran's attire, his posture. Like a cell's word perpetually looking for the next opportunity. Davos scratched his beard. "You wish to be Lord of Highgarden?" Bran smirked. "Don't wish, Your Grace. I was promised. Good for the realm, I hear, to have a strong leader in the Reach, someone who can keep order and ensure the grain keeps flowing." Davos sighed, evidently not thrilled, but resigned. "If that's the arrangement, then so be it, as long as you maintain the peace and protect the small folk. If you turn tyrant, we'll take it away." "Agreed." Bran's grin widened. "I'll be on my best behavior." Tyrion couldn't help but feel a pang of concern. Giving Highgarden to a man like Bran was far from ideal, but Davos was pragmatic. The realm needed the Reach stabilized, and as Bran said, a display of steel and coin might be the swiftest solution. Tyrion just prayed that Bran would not grow too ambitious. Back in the north, Sansa received a raven from King's Landing. It carried news of the realm's progress. Trade treaties, the naming of new lords, the hopeful signs that the war-torn kingdom might be healing. She read it by the glow of a lamp in her solar, her lips turning in a thoughtful line. Part of her was glad that the south was becoming stable. Another part worried that eventually some future king or queen might forget the promises made to the north. But for now she trusted Davos. He had never broken his word yet. Her steward entered, bowing. "Your Grace, the Mandoli envoy is here to speak about the shipping routes from White Harbor." She set the letter aside, smoothing the folds of her dress. "Show them in." There was always more work to do: treaties, trade, local disputes. Ruling was a never-ending tapestry of details, especially with winter's chill always looming. But at least she did it on her own terms, in the land she loved, among her own people. That gave her strength. And as the envoy arrived, Sansa stood, the queen in the north, resolute, determined. She would see her people through whatever came next. In those days of relative calm, though not without myriad challenges, the realm felt a sense of fragile renewal. Bran Stark was nowhere to be found in the records of King's Landing, nor in Winterfell's halls, at least not for long. Whispers abounded of a young man in a wheeled chair traveling across the land, sometimes glimpsed at a village near the neck, other times rumored to be in the godwood of Riverrun, or even in an ancient forest beyond the wall. He was akin to a specter, drifting wherever the weirwood trees stood, communing with something older than memory. Now and again, a raven would arrive bearing no message, only a feeling, as if to say, "I am watching." Yet if Bran had wanted the throne, he had turned his back on it entirely. History would record that the three-eyed raven refused the crown, leaving a humble smuggler to mend a fractured realm. And in that refusal, perhaps, lay the realm's best chance for peace. For few men in power could claim no thirst for it, and Davos, stumbling though he often did, guided the kingdoms with a gentle, steady hand. Seasons would turn. Crops would grow. People would love, fight, make mistakes, and learn. But for a time, at least, the cycle of death that had gripped Westeros loosened its hold. No grand songs would likely be written of King Davos's conquest, for it was no conquest at all. Instead, the bards might one day sing of how a once impoverished smuggler rose to unite a broken kingdom by dint of honesty, compassion, and humility. They would speak of the city rising from its ashes, of treaties made without the threat of dragons, of a king who dined with commoners to hear their plights firsthand. Perhaps more quietly, they'd speak of Sansa Stark, the Northern Queen who ruled her own land wisely, forging a path for her people to find strength in independence. They'd tell of Jon Snow, the man who walked away from crowns to guard the realms of men, keeping his lonely vigil against the ghosts of winter. And in soft hushes, they might mention the boy who became a raven, who saw it all and made a choice that saved them from yet another war. Yes, the realm was shaped by kings who refused power, queens who bore sorrow and used it for wisdom, and a scattered family that found unexpected ways to protect the world they loved. And so, in the bittersweet tapestry of Westeros, Bran Stark's refusal was not a tragedy but a quiet revolution. A single syllable "no" echoed across the Seven Kingdoms, forging a new age from the rubble of the old and offering the promise, however tenuous, that perhaps Westeros might at last learn to break the wheel of endless bloodshed and build something gentler in its place. The days stretched into weeks and the weeks into months until the swirl of seasons touched every corner of Westeros. Though the land had been carved by the fires of dragons and the sword thrusts of endless wars, a new shape began to emerge, one defined not by conquest but by slow, careful rebuilding. King Davos Seaworth found himself at the heart of that transformation, though it still felt peculiar to him each dawn. He would wake in the royal chambers of the Red Keep, chambers half-ruined not so long ago, wash his face in a battered silver basin, and stare out over a city groaning back to life. Everywhere he looked, people worked. Hammers rang on timbers, cartwheels clattered over cobblestones, and scaffolds rose like spindly bones on once devastated streets. The dragon pit's silhouette still marred the skyline, yet it also housed part of the city's slow resurrection, acting now as a site for storing building materials rather than hosting monstrous beasts. He took no pleasure in courtly excess. Instead, he wore plain, serviceable clothes most days, simple doublets and breeches of dark cloth, a cloak of thick wool, and boots that had seen wear upon his old smuggling skiffs. The circlet of gold resting on his brow felt as strange as ever, and more than once he nearly forgot to don it before venturing out among his subjects. The small folk seemed to accept him nonetheless. They remembered him feeding children in the streets, or parleying for them when other lords might have overlooked their hunger. They told stories of how he had once risked life and limb to bring onions and salted fish to the starving men at Storm's End, defying both blockade and fear. Now, those small acts of compassion echoed louder than any speech from a fancy throne. Yet for all his humility, Davos knew a single misstep could plunge the kingdom into turmoil again. He clung to Tyrion's advice on matters of political cunning. Tyrion, in turn, relied on Davos's sincerity to soothe lords who recalled the Lannister name with rancor. Together, they created a balance of steel and velvet, enough steel to keep the unscrupulous at bay, enough velvet to keep the realm from chafing under new edicts. Early one morning, Davos called a meeting in the repaired throne room. Wooden beams, charred in places, now formed a crude, vaulted ceiling. The Iron Throne was gone, of course, but an elevated dais held a new seat draped with banners that bore Davos's sigil, a black ship on a field divided with the Baratheon stag. Around him assembled the small council. Tyrion stood at his right, slender fingers laced before him. Samwell Tarly wore his heavy chain of office, the rings of which clinked softly whenever he moved. Brienne of Tarth kept a respectful distance behind them in white cloak and polished armor, gazing about with calm vigilance. Gendry was present as master of ships, alongside a handful of lesser courtiers who had earned the king's trust. Davos sat, pressing his palms on his knees as he surveyed those gathered. "We've heard rumors," he began quietly, "that the Iron Islands are uneasy about our arrangement. Yara Greyjoy was content enough so far, but I'm told a few of her captains advocate more raids along the western coasts, testing our hold. That's the last thing we need, any spark that might reignite the fear and anger we've just barely quelled." Tyrion cleared his throat. "Yara has always been pragmatic. She'll rein in those captains if we handle it carefully. But if we try to tighten our fist on them, they'll slip away. Best to meet her halfway, offer a formal recognition of her authority over the Isles, let them keep their maritime traditions, and maybe emphasize that any raids against the Six Kingdoms will be treated as outright piracy. She knows we cannot allow armed raids, but she might accept a compromise to satisfy the more restless among her followers." Davos nodded. "So we let her taste near independence, but stop short of letting them roam free to pillage. A tightrope walk, but that's what we seem to do best." Brienne's voice was calm but firm. "I've seen how the Ironborn treat compromise. We must be certain that any agreement has teeth behind it, a consequence if they violate our terms." Davos exchanged a glance with Tyrion. "I'm afraid you're right. Perhaps we should send a royal envoy to the Iron Islands. Someone who can speak plainly yet make it clear we stand ready for retribution if they go too far." Samwell Tarly lifted a hand to catch Davos's attention. "If I may, Suggs, Gendry could serve that purpose well. He's the master of ships, and his father was a Baratheon. The Ironborn remember King Robert's wrath on the seas. Gendry's presence might remind them we haven't forgotten how to wage war at sea, if forced." Gendry shifted on his feet, frowning slightly. "I'm no statesman, but I can sail, and I'll make sure they know we mean business. If that's your command, your grace, I'll do it." Davos allowed a small smile. "You're a good lad, Gendry. Thank you. I'll have letters drafted for your mission. We'll try to keep things civil. The last thing I want is more blood in the water." The matter set, Davos moved on to other concerns. The appointment of local magistrates, the distribution of coin to rebuilding efforts in the Crownlands, the need for more farmers in the war-ravaged fields. Piece by piece, they mapped out the realm's slow climb from ruin. Tyrion took careful notes, Samwell offered measured counsel, and Brienne listened for any sign of duplicity among the lords who would soon gather at court. When the meeting ended, Davos rose from the seat, pressing his hands into the small of his back with a grimace. "I never realized sitting could be such a chore. I long for the days when my biggest problem was smuggling onions past a blockade." Tyrion smirked. "Or adjusting your gloves to hide your shortened fingertips, I suppose. Yet here you are, the realm's moral compass." Davos snorted with something like amusement. "Seven help us, if that's the case." Tyrion gave a short bow and departed, leaving Davos to greet a line of petitioners. The throne room was not as spacious or ornate as it had once been. Parts of it were still under repair, but enough columns and corners remained for a proper queue. Men and women came forward, each with stories of woe or requests for the crown's intervention. A merchant complained about dock thieves at the port. A blacksmith sought permission to expand his workshop into a burned-out district. A small folk mother asked for justice against a knight who had seized her farmland. In each case, Davos listened with patient, if weary, attention. He deferred to Tyrion for legal nuances, to Samwell for references to old precedents, to Brienne if a matter required an investigation by the crown's men-at-arms. Step by step, they tried to mete out fairness. It might have been a trickle, but it felt more honest than the grandiose royal courts that had come before, where power games overshadowed the people's pleas. By dusk, the line was gone. Davos rose from the battered throne, shoulders stiff. Before he could withdraw to his chambers, a figure appeared at the far end of the hall. A messenger from House Frey, what remained of that disgraced name, tentatively stepping forward. Davos waved him on. The man bowed, presenting a sealed scroll. "From the twins, your grace," the messenger said. "The lord thereof requests your word on the matter of tolls along the Trident." Davos's mouth twitched with distaste. The Freys had lost much after their treachery at the Red Wedding, and many of them had perished under the wave of vengeance that followed. Some offshoot now held the twins, though the name Frey was so tarnished it scarcely commanded respect. "I'll have Tyrion draft a reply," Davos said, taking the parchment. "Safe travels, friend." He and the messenger exchanged a curt bow, and Davos found a moment to wonder how the realm had come to such a pass that a man like him was receiving missives from the twins, as though it were the most normal thing in the world. Steeling himself, he returned to the Solar, where Tyrion was already scanning documents by torchlight. The night's labors, it seemed, would be long. Still, as Davos sank into a chair, swirling a cup of watered wine, he felt a curious sense of acceptance. This was the path he had set upon when he agreed to wear the crown, an unending march of small details, humble pleas, and slow but tangible progress. At times, he envied Sansa Stark, who ruled a single kingdom where the people were largely united by tradition and a shared identity. Then again, the North had its own hardships, with brutal winters and long memories. No, Davos reminded himself, every throne was a burden. Perhaps it was best that so many tasks fell to him. He was old enough to know how to weather storms and decent enough, he hoped, not to become callous. He read the Frey scroll, frowned at the brazen request for increased tolls, and set it aside for Tyrion's counsel. Night was full upon the castle walls, and the flicker of torchlight danced across the Solar's stone floor. Even then, more petitioners waited outside. With a resigned nod, Davos motioned for the guards to let the next one in. In the north, Sansa Stark's reign as queen was forging a new identity for her people. Winterfell's courtyard bustled with activity. Herds of sheep and goats arrived from the high meadows, and flocks of geese wandered about in search of stray grain. Blacksmiths rang their hammers, forging new plowshares and arrowheads alike. The air carried the smell of wood smoke and pine. It was busy, but it was also calm, the old heart of the North beating with fresh determination. Sansa often walked the ramparts of Winterfell, gazing out across the gray plains beyond the walls, reflecting on how much her home had changed. The ghosts of the past lingered in every tower and archway. Her father's gentle laugh, her mother's strict but loving gaze, Robb's voice echoing during drills in the yard. She felt them all. Yet she had no time to lose herself in remembrance. The North demanded a leader who acted in the present. She spent her mornings meeting with the Northern Lords, ensuring that trade routes to White Harbor were secure and that local disputes did not fester. In the afternoons, she'd visit the workshops where wool cloaks were sewn and salted meats prepared for storage, offering her presence as a quiet reminder that she cared for the well-being of those who toiled. The Northern Lords had grown accustomed to seeing their queen among them, no longer hidden away in private chambers but walking freely, hearing their grievances, dispensing justice when needed. Even those who once viewed her with suspicion for her time in King's Landing admitted, if only grudgingly, that she had come into her own. She was not naive about the complexities of power. She knew that some houses still bristled at a woman's rule, especially one so young. Others whispered that a Stark alone should not make all decisions for the North. But she drew upon alliances carefully knit over time. The Manderleys of White Harbor stood firmly on her side, grateful for how she had recognized their efforts during the Battle of the Bastards and the war against the dead. The remnants of House Glover, bruised by their own miscalculations, tried to curry favor. House Serwyn and House Tallheart pledged devotion, swearing it in front of their own men. And so, through vigilance and quiet strength, Sansa held the North together. In the privacy of her solar, when the day's tasks ended, Sansa would sometimes let the mask slip. She'd brew a small pot of mint tea, inherited from the meager southern stores, and watch the sky dim into twilight. Those were the moments her mind drifted south, wondering about Jon, exiled at the Wall. She regretted how that had come about, yet she understood the necessity. She wondered if he slept well in the frigid nights of Castle Black, or if he roamed with Tormund's wildlings as the wind scoured the tundra. She also thought of Arya, sailing west of Westeros, braving unknown seas where no maps existed. Could Arya have found new lands, or was she simply drifting into the eternal horizon? She hoped her sister had found the freedom she always sought. Most often, though, Sansa's thoughts returned to Bran. Once he had been a bright-eyed boy who loved to climb walls. Now he was something else, a being that hovered between the mortal and the mystical. He had refused the throne with quiet finality, then vanished on journeys only he understood. Occasionally, a raven might appear on Winterfell's windowsill, and Sansa would have the odd sense that her brother's consciousness drifted within its black eyes. But no direct message came. She found herself both missing him and accepting that he was no longer bound to ordinary mortal ties. That acceptance did not erase her wish to speak with him once more, if only to share the burdens of rule for a moment. She took solace in the knowledge that the North, at least, was free from further tyranny. The Southern wars no longer reached this far. If brigands roamed, they were small in number, easily repelled by the hardy northern folk. Food was scarce, but not so scarce as to threaten a famine. Each day, with methodical patience, Sansa's stewards stored salted meats, dried fruits, and whatever else might sustain them through the next winter. If the South was truly regaining stability, trade could flourish, and the North would not want for vital goods. Yet should the day come when the South once more tried to impose itself, Sansa would meet that day with a united North behind her. That quiet vow gave her the strength to press on, guiding the myriad tasks that kept Winterfell's hearth lit. Far beyond the bustle of mortal politics, Jon Snow rode through drifts of snow so deep that his mare had to plunge forward with labored steps. The icy wind cut across his face, turning each breath into a visible plume. On his left, Tormund Giantsbane trudged along, leading his great shaggy horse, cursing under his breath about the cold. A small contingent of free folk followed, pushing a ramshackle cart laden with supplies. Ghost padded silently at Jon's side, his white fur blending almost seamlessly with the snowy expanse. They were on a journey north of the Wall, though the exact nature of the quest was unremarkable. Simply the matter of escorting a group of free folk back to their ancestral dwelling places now that the worst threats had vanished. Jon remembered the old days when the free folk had been forced to bend the knee to survive or else die at the hands of White Walkers. That terror was gone, replaced by uneasy cooperation. Now, many free folk traveled back to the wide wilderness they preferred, while some remained near Castle Black to share resources. Jon found a small measure of solace in that arrangement. Once, he had tried to broker peace between the Night's Watch and the wildlings, and though it had cost him dearly, it had ultimately saved countless lives. The sky overhead was a pale, slate gray, promising more snow by nightfall. Tormund cast a glance at Jon, squinting against a gust of wind. "I never thought I'd say this, but it's too bloody cold. We should find shelter soon." Jon nodded, scanning the horizon. "There's an outpost not far from here. At least there used to be. The Watch once built small refuges near the Frostfangs. We can try to find what's left." Tormund gave a short laugh that lacked real mirth. "I used to be. Seems half the world used to be something else." They pressed on for another hour, slow and punishing. When they finally spotted a rough shape of wood and stone jutting from a rise, relief swept through the group. Approaching warily, Jon recognized it as the skeleton of an old watch station, battered but still standing. The roof sagged, and the door had rotted off the hinges, but it offered a break from the wind. They hurried inside, shooing out a family of small foxes that had nested in the corner. A hush settled as the free folk started to build a fire from whatever dry tinder they could scrounge, while Tormund scouted around for signs of game. Jon tied his horse under a makeshift awning, removing the saddle and patting the mare's flank. He whispered a soft apology for the grueling journey. Then he stepped inside the weather-beaten shelter, stamping snow from his boots. A few others were talking quietly, rummaging through their supplies for anything edible. Ghost settled near the entrance, ever watchful. Jon unshouldered the heavy pack he carried. Inside, along with salted meat and spare clothing, he kept a small leather-bound book of scribbled notes, sketches of the region, and marks of safe routes, knowledge gleaned over countless rides beyond the Wall. He had intended to share these with the Night's Watch to help guide future patrols. Idly, he flipped through the pages by the flickering firelight, gazing at his scrawled handwriting. Memories washed over him. Nights spent in the stark quiet of these lands, the camaraderie with those who had once been enemies, the despair and hope that mingled in the final battles against the dead. He felt Tormund's presence at his shoulder. The red-bearded man tossed a couple of frozen rabbits onto the stone floor with a grunt of triumph. Food, Tormund said. Not much, but it'll fill a belly. Jon closed the book, nodding. Well done. We'll skin them, get them on the fire. They set to work, a grim but familiar routine. Soon enough, the meager stew in a dented pot offered warmth and a savory scent. The free folk told stories in low voices, some of them half drifting to sleep in the corners. The wind outside picked up, howling across the open plain like a lonely specter. Jon found himself listening to it, lulled into that meditative state that came so often these days. At times, he felt more a specter himself than a living man. He had died once, after all, and come back. He had held a queen in his arms while life slipped from her. He had been crowned king in the north, then parted from that crown just as swiftly. There was an odd sense of relief in the simplicity of this existence. He needed no crown here, no seat upon a throne. The vow he kept, the watch, required only that he remain vigilant and honor the living. As he listened to the wind, he suddenly caught a sharp scraping noise outside. Ghost's ears perked up. Tormund rose, a hand on his axe. Jon motioned for silence. He moved to the doorway, stepped out into the whirling snow. Visibility was poor, but he could make out a shape approaching from the north, hunched and slow. Jon tensed, half expecting a wild beast or a stray giant. He stood poised for a threat, but as the shape drew nearer, he discerned a single figure, cloaked in white fur, plodding with a staff for support. Hello? Jon called over the gale. The figure paused, lifted a head clad in a hood. Then, in a voice cracked with exhaustion, the stranger called back, Help, is there shelter? Jon motioned. Aye, we have a fire. Be quick. The figure stumbled forward. As they came into the flickering glow of the outpost's entry, Jon realized the traveler was a middle-aged woman with lines of weariness etched into her face. Snow clung to her hair. She might have been a free folk gatherer or a wanderer from some hidden settlement. She clutched a worn satchel at her side. Thank you, she managed, breath ragged. I've been following old tracks. Thought I was lost for good. Jon guided her inside, where Tormund and the others offered space by the fire. She fell to her knees, rubbing numb hands, blinking in relief. After a moment, she fumbled with her satchel, pulling out a small clay flask. Name's Kovan, she said. Came from the far western edges. My kin are gone. I tried to head south, but the snows came early. Not sure if I'll make it. Tormund offered her a portion of the rabbit stew, and she ate in ravenous gulps, tears springing to her eyes at the warmth. Jon observed, offering a simple greeting, but Kovan's attention was too fixed on the stew to answer. Once she had devoured it, she looked up watery-eyed. Didn't think I'd see another soul, she said. Not since the crows retreated south. Are you crows? Jon took a moment. I was. Name's Jon Snow. I'm with the Night's Watch still, in a way. Though things have changed. This is Tormund Giantsbane, and these folk are free folk. Kovan let her gaze wander. She seemed neither fearful nor hostile, just bone-tired. Strange times. I remember when the free folk and the crows were killing each other. Now you share a fire. Jon exhaled, feeling the weight of old history. Aye. We learned the cost of not standing together. Kovan nodded slowly, her eyes drifting half-closed. Tormund tossed another piece of kindling onto the fire, and the group settled into an uneasy rest for the night. Jon took the first watch, leaning against the warped timbers near the door, Ghost at his feet. From time to time, he glanced at Kovan, wondering what she had witnessed out in the wilds. He knew better than most that the north was not as empty as some believed. Old, forgotten things could lurk amid the snowdrifts. But at least the others were gone. If any shadow remained of that ancient threat, it was scattered to the corners of the world. Jon kept his vigil until the sky lightened into a dawn of blurred white and gray. By then, Kovan was stirring. She stretched painfully as though every muscle ached and rubbed her hands over her face. Outside, the wind had calmed a fraction. Softly, she approached Jon, hugging her furs around her narrow shoulders. I've heard tales, she said, glancing at him sidelong, that the black-haired crow with a dire wolf was the one who destroyed the Night King. Jon swallowed. Memories of the Battle of Winterfell. The swirling chaos, the armies of the dead, Arya's final blow. Not me, he said quietly. That was someone else. A sister of mine. Kovan studied him as if trying to reconcile rumor and truth. Eventually, she nodded. Either way, the dead are gone. But I fear new dangers. I've seen footprints in the snow, men prowling about, armed, hunting for survivors. Not crows, not free folk, and not starving. They wore black leathers, faces painted. I hid, but they gave me a fright. Could be bandits. Jon frowned. Tormund, overhearing, came closer. What kind of men, exactly? Tormund asked, voice gruff. Kovan shook her head. Never saw them clear. But they carried steel well, moved in formation. Not a rabble. I suspect they're mercenaries who deserted some southern lord's cause. Or maybe some ghost of House Bolton, though the Boltons are gone, aren't they? A chill not born of the weather slithered down John's spine. They should be. But we've enough reason to keep watch. We'll stay alert. Though it was not the first time John had heard rumors of stray bands. Some men thrived on violence and drifted north seeking easy targets, far from southern law. The north was vast, dotted with small homesteads and free folk camps. If these marauders roamed unchecked, they could bring terror to unsuspecting people. John felt a pang of duty. He might not be king in the north anymore, but he was still a Stark by blood, and these were still the realms of men he had sworn to protect. He resolved to investigate. When dawn allowed enough visibility, the small party continued north for a short while, ensuring the free folk found their path. But John informed Tormund of his intent to backtrack south and see if he could pick up the trail of these mystery raiders. Tormund agreed, spitting to the side. I'll come with you. We can't let that sort of filth run loose. Not if we want to keep these roads safe. Kovan decided to accompany them. She had nowhere else to go, no family left, and the idea of traveling with men who knew the land appealed to her more than heading south alone. Together, they parted ways with the free folk group who continued deeper into the true wild. John, Tormund, Kovan, and 3 others from Tormund's band turned back, riding carefully, scanning the horizon for any sign of footprints or smoke. They found signs soon enough, tracks in the snow, a discarded scrap of CL. Off near a scraggly pine stand. The footprints suggested 6 or 7 men wearing heavy boots, possibly armed with swords. John and Tormund followed the trail, which wound around low hills and patches of frozen forest. By the time dusk neared, they spotted a curl of smoke on the horizon. Carefully, they advanced until they stood on a rise overlooking a hollow. Below, they glimpsed a rough camp, a couple of tents pitched behind a stand of pines, a single, flickering fire. John signaled the others to dismount and proceed quietly on foot. Ghost slunk ahead, silent as death in the snow. As they crept closer, they heard voices, a low, muttering conversation in the common tongue. Tormund cast John a wary look. John nodded, pressing a finger to his lips. Then, with stealth born of experience, they approached until they could peer through the pine boughs. 8 men lounged around the fire. Their armor was mismatched, featuring black leathers or old boiled leather plates, some bits of fur. One brandished a sword with an etched hilt, another a crossbow. Their faces bore the marks of rough living, dirty, scruffy, eyes flickering with latent aggression. One man had a sigil embroidered on a ragged surcoat, a flayed man. John felt his blood run cold at the sight. That crest, the old banner of House Bolton, had no place in a world that was supposed to be rid of them. John motioned Tormund and the others back a step, and they retreated out of earshot. Kovan's eyes were wide with alarm. Tormund scowled fiercely. Bolton men, Tormund muttered. Or at least men wearing that damned sigil. I thought that line was wiped out. So did I, John said, voice grim. Either they're leftovers from Ramsay's hordes or opportunists wearing the flayed man to inspire fear. Either way, they pose a threat. Kovan wrapped her arms around herself. They were the ones I saw, I'm certain. Looks like they've set up a camp here, well hidden from any patrol. John narrowed his eyes, struggling to tamp down the anger rising in his chest. Thoughts of the atrocities committed by House Bolton returned, how Ramsay tortured and flayed, how he slaughtered innocents without mercy. John had believed that legacy ended on the battlefield outside Winterfell the day the Stark banners were raised again. Yet here was a reminder that evil could cling on in the dark corners of the world. He cast a glance at Tormund. We can't just leave them be. If they raid free folk or travelers, it'll be on our heads. Tormund nodded vigorously. We should kill them. John let out a breath. The simplest solution might indeed be to strike them down, but he remembered what Davos and the others had fought for, a realm that did not turn to slaughter as the first option. Yet these were violent men, possibly flayers. He doubted they'd surrender if confronted. He glanced at Kovan, thinking of how she had nearly frozen to death alone. If men like these roamed about, no one was safe. All right, John said quietly. We'll approach, see if they'll stand down or surrender. But we go in ready for a fight. If they choose violence, we answer in kind. Tormund's grin was wolfish. That's more like it. They split into 2 groups. John and Tormund circled to one flank, Kovan and the others to the other side, Ghost slinking around yet another angle. When they were in position, John stood, calling out in a clear voice. You there, by the fire. Let us speak. Lay down your arms. Instantly, commotion erupted in the camp. The men scrambled to their feet, hands on swords or crossbows. One barked a curse. Another hissed, who's there? John stepped forward just enough to be seen. Jon Snow of the Night's Watch. A moment of stunned silence, then snickering. One of the men wearing a battered helm spat into the snow. Night's Watch? Lads, that's a ghost story if ever I heard one. The watch is near dead. And you're no king if that's what you're wanting us to believe. Didn't you used to call yourself king in the north? Jon's jaw tightened. I'm no king. I'm here to keep the peace. You're wearing the sigil of House Bolton. That sigil's been outlawed. Put down your weapons and come with us to the wall. You won't be harmed if you surrender. A few of the bandits laughed. The man with the crossbow cocked it. You must be mad if you think we'll bend the knee to some black-clad crow. We like it here just fine. Tormund, from his flank, bellowed, you can surrender or you can die. Take your pick. That tore it. The bandit with the crossbow fired off a bolt. It whizzed past Tormund's head, missing by a hair's breadth. Tormund cursed and charged forward, raising his axe. Jon drew Longclaw, that familiar weight in his hand, and rushed in from the other side. Ghost leapt from behind the pines, teeth bared, slamming into a man who tried to spin around to slash at Jon. The clearing erupted in chaos. 3 bandits rushed Jon with swords. He parried the first blow, stepping into the swing and driving his shoulder into the man's chest, knocking him off balance. The second bandit lunged from Jon's left, forcing Jon to twist aside to avoid the thrust. Longclaw flashed in the dim light, catching the bandit's torso in a diagonal slash that drew a cry of pain. Blood sprayed across the snow. Tormund met 2 foes head-on, roaring like a bear, his axe chopping fiercely. One man stumbled under the ferocity while the other tried to flank Tormund. Covan hurled a throwing dagger from the trees, lodging it in a bandit's shoulder. The man howled, dropping his sword. Another of Tormund's wildlings rushed in and ended him with a savage strike. The man sporting the Bolton sigil tried to rally the others, shouting curses, but Ghost lunged at him, snapping at his forearm. He yelped, stumbling back and barely keeping his balance. Jon pivoted, blade raised. The man's eyes flicked between Jon and the direwolf. Traitor, he spat. You were always a traitor, Snow. Bolton gave you mercy once. Jon's mind flickered with old rage. There had never been mercy from Ramsay Bolton. He advanced, calm but relentless. The man swung wildly, but Jon caught the blow with Longclaw's Valyrian steel, disarming him in a single twist. A swift kick to the back of the man's knee sent him to the ground. Jon pressed Longclaw's tip to his throat. Surrender, Jon said, breathing heavily. The man's eyes flared with defiance. He lunged up, forcing the blade to pierce his own neck. With a gurgling hiss, he collapsed, blood staining the snow. Jon withdrew, heart pounding. The clearing fell quiet, aside from the heavy panting of those who survived. Tormund stood among the bodies, leaning on his axe, flecks of blood on his ginger beard. Covan and the others emerged from the pines, catching their breath. It was over in moments. 8 men lay in the snow, all dead except for 2 who moaned with mortal wounds. Jon had never taken pleasure in killing, but a cold finality settled over him now. If they had lived, they would have terrorized innocents. Yet the old question haunted him, did more blood truly solve the realm's problems or merely continue them? He crouched by one of the dying bandits who clutched a stomach wound. Why the Bolton sigil? Jon asked softly. Bolton's gone. The man gave a delirious grin, blood on his lips. His ghost, never gone, fierce power, we took what we wanted. The words broke into a final rattling cough. Jon closed his eyes, feeling a pang of revulsion. Fear. That was always Ramsay's currency. Even from the grave, it seemed men still tried to exploit it. Tormund exhaled a growl. No place for them. The North is better off without scum like this. Jon stared at the bodies a moment longer. He found no pride in their deaths. But he understood Tormund's harsh truth. These men would only have spread more suffering. Perhaps that was the nature of the New Age. Peace might sprout in many places, but pockets of old horror could still fester, needing a firm hand to uproot them. That night, they burned the bodies in a pit, letting the smoke rise into the star-flecked sky. Covan stood nearby, silent. When the flames licked high, Jon turned away, letting the light bathe the back of his cloak. He felt no triumph. If anything, the scuffle left him more resolved to keep watch over these northern lands. Even if his official title was a formality, he would not abandon the people who depended on him. Word of the skirmish eventually reached Winterfell, carried by a ranger who had seen the aftermath. The tale of the Bolton Sigil bandits caused a minor stir among the northern lords. Though no one truly believed that House Bolton could return, the very mention of flayed men still had the power to chill spines. Sansa Stark learned of the incident from her steward, who reported that Jon Snow had dealt with the threat. Sansa felt a swirl of relief and sorrow, knowing her brother, or cousin as the truth might be, was forced again into violent action. The winter winds had started to blow more keenly, a reminder that the north must always be prepared. In the courtyard, stable hands readied horses for a group of messengers traveling south, carrying letters to the newly built or rebuilt settlements. The North's population had grown sparser, scattered after the wars, making it a challenge to govern effectively. Sansa planned to recall them to central areas for better security as the cold months deepened. It was a practical measure, though not always popular. Some families preferred their ancestral huts in the middle of nowhere, but Sansa knew that bandits or simple exposure could claim those who stayed too isolated. The watchers in the far-flung towers had reported enough suspicious movement to put everyone on edge. After a full morning of giving orders, Sansa retreated to her solar for a brief respite. A cup of hot cider steamed on the table and she inhaled the spiced scent. She read again the note concerning the Bolton remnants, letting the anger roll through her. Ramsay had once forced her to unspeakable humiliations. Even his specter in the form of these bandits was enough to tighten her stomach with old dread. She took a steadying breath, forcing the memories away. She had survived the cruelty and reclaimed her home. She would not let fear rule her now. A soft knock on the door made her straighten. Brienne of Tarth entered, having arrived from King's Landing the previous evening to confer with Sansa about alliance matters. The tall knight gave a respectful bow. "Your Grace," Brienne said, voice level. "I've looked into the rumors of scattered Bolton loyalists. It appears it was just a group of Sel's words wearing that sigil. No official ties remain." Sansa nodded grimly. "I expected as much. Jon dealt with them, I hear." "Yes," Brienne said. "He left few survivors. The North is safer now." Sansa closed her eyes briefly. "I wish it didn't come to such bloodshed, but I'm glad he was there." Brienne shifted, hesitant. "I also bring news from King's Landing. King Davos as well as his Lord Tyrion. They are working on alliances with Dorne, the Iron Islands, and House Tarly in the Reach Samwell's kin. Trade routes are improving." "That's good to hear," Sansa said, letting out a soft sigh. "If they keep stability, it means fewer threats nipping at our borders." "Have they asked anything of the North?" "Only for continued goodwill and open trade," Brienne said. "They seem intent on honoring the arrangement that the North remains independent. King Davos has no appetite for imposing on the North's sovereignty. So far, he has not sought any marriage alliances with our lords, though Tyrion did raise the prospect of forging stronger bonds." Sansa made a thoughtful noise, swirling her cider in its cup. She had considered the possibility that the new king might try to marry someone from a powerful northern house. It would not be the first time the crown tried to secure loyalty that way. Yet Davos's humility was genuine, it seemed. She sensed no manipulative designs on her domain. "I'm pleased, though I remain cautious," Sansa said. "It takes only one crisis for a southern king or queen to recall the old oaths. But Davos Seaworth is not the sort to break faith easily. I'll keep watch." Brienne inclined her head. "A wise approach, Your Grace." They spoke further about mundane matters, merchant caravans, a possible council of northern lords to standardize taxes, and the necessity of a winter storehouse in each major holdfast. Brienne, who had grown more comfortable speaking her mind, offered suggestions drawn from her own experiences. Despite the heavy burdens, they found an odd sense of positivity in planning for the future without immediate war overshadowing every decision. That evening, Sansa held a small feast in honor of Brienne's visit. The main hall of Winterfell was aglow with firelight. Tables were laid with roasted venison, roasted turnips, and the last of the autumn apples. Ale flowed, though not in excess, and a few bards from the local villages played soft tunes. It was far from the lavish feasts of the South, but for the North it felt just grand enough, symbolic of times that were, at least for the moment, peaceful. Brienne sat near Sansa, as did a handful of northern lords. The conversation touched on the days of the war, the specter of the Night King, and the changes since the Great Council. At one point, Lord Glover, an older man who had once refused Sansa's call, asked if there had been any sign of the three-eyed raven. An uncomfortable hush followed, as many remembered Bran with superstition or awe. Sansa gently deflected, stating that her brother traveled often, ensuring the realm's memory would not be lost. She sensed that even if she tried to explain Bran's nature, most would not grasp it. While the bards struck up a more joyful ballad, Sansa excused herself to step outside for a breath of the cold northern air. She wandered into the courtyard, the sky overhead so clear that each star sparkled like a shard of ice. For a moment, she remembered how she used to dream of courtly life in King's Landing, of handsome princes and bright tournaments. Now, after tasting the bitterness behind those illusions, she felt more at home in the hush of Winterfell's yard under a stark sky. She closed her eyes, listening to the wind sigh through the ramparts. When she opened them again, she nearly gasped to see a single raven perched atop a half-toppled archway. It looked at her with an uncanny stillness, head tilted. Sansa's breath caught. She couldn't say why, but she felt certain it was Bran, or at least connected to him. She tried to speak, but no words came. The raven flapped its wings once and was gone, vanishing into the black night as though it had never been there. Sansa stood alone a moment longer, a faint smile on her lips. Perhaps her brother was closer than she knew. Southward, at the crossroads in one of the busiest inns in all of Westeros, travelers from every corner gathered. Merchants hauling goods from the Reach, soldiers returning home after mustering out of someone's service, and messengers bearing ravens for distant lords milled about in a chaotic swirl. The building had been burned and rebuilt more times than anyone cared to count, but it stood strong again, testament to the resilience of the land. The common room bustled with talk of the new king, the new queen in the north, and the slow healing that might finally bring respite to a weary people. A hooded figure slipped into the inn at dusk, moving with quiet purpose. Nobody paid much attention. Hooded wanderers were hardly a rarity on the roads. The figure found a corner table and settled, removing heavy gloves and flexing slender fingers. When the innkeep approached to offer ale and a trencher of stew, the hooded one spoke in a low voice, with the faint accent of the north. "Anything fresh?" the traveler asked. The innkeep, a stout woman with a cheery face, set down a bowl of thick stew. "Fresh as can be, though the barley's a bit old. We've onions and salt pork aplenty." "Where are you coming from?" The traveler's lips quirked. "The northern roads. Busy up there, so they say. Queen Sansa's making changes, or so folk talk." "Are you heading south? Maybe to King's Landing?" The traveler shrugged. "Perhaps, if the roads allow." The innkeep leaned in conspiratorially. "Well, word is King Davos is a kindly sort, but I hear troubles stirring in some corners. Old loyalists, new pretenders. We'll see if the realm holds steady." She patted the traveler's arm. "Enjoy your meal." She drifted away to tend other customers. The hooded figure sipped the stew, eyes scanning the crowd. Conversations overlapped in a tumult. A pair of merchants bragged about selling casks of arbor gold at triple the usual price. A sellsword boasted of having once guarded Daenerys Targaryen, though the details sounded suspiciously exaggerated. A group of minstrels tuned a lute. The figure's keen gaze flicked to a table by the fireplace, where an older man with a battered breastplate sat alone. He bore a device on his shoulder, a black ring around a tower. It was not a well-known sigil, but the traveler recognized it as belonging to a minor lord sworn to House Tully. The older man noticed the stare and raised a mug in a silent toast, though the traveler made no move to join him. Instead, the traveler finished the stew, left a coin on the table, and quietly rose to leave. The main door let in a gust of cold air as the night's wind rushed inside, setting the lanterns flickering. Once outside, the traveler exhaled a frosty breath into the darkness and pulled the hood tighter. The figure led a horse from the stable yard. By the pale light of the moon, one could see the traveler more clearly. A woman of lithe build with short-cropped hair that framed a youthful face etched by more experience than her years should allow. She had the look of the north in her gray eyes, though her stride was as silent as a cat's. She mounted swiftly and set out toward the south. The traveler was Arya Stark. She had sailed west as she once vowed, but her curiosity and sense of restlessness had eventually brought her back to the edges of the known world, then across the Sunset Sea to the port of Old Town, and from there on a winding journey northward. She had not made her presence widely known, preferring to wander as a free spirit. Yet something had drawn her back to the roads of Westeros, perhaps the faint tug of family or the simple knowledge that her homeland's story was not yet finished. She did not seek to be recognized as Lady Arya. She wore no sigil, told no stories of her house, and asked no favors. She was merely a traveler with bright steel at her hip and an alertness in her gaze that suggested she had faced worse than highway bandits. As she guided her horse away from the crossroads inn, she heard muffled laughter from within, saw the glow of its hearth beckoning. Once, this place had been near the center of so many events, where the roads to the north, east, south, and west converged. Now it was merely a waypoint for the traffic of a kingdom trying to rebuild. Still, it reminded Arya how interconnected the realm truly was. Every rumor, every snippet of news passed through these roads eventually. She rode through the night, keeping to the main path but veering off whenever she sensed a wagon train or party of strangers ahead. Old instincts died hard. She had spent years surviving on her wits, learning the value of remaining unseen. Though the realm was at peace, relatively speaking, she knew that the scars of war and the potential for cruelty never vanished entirely. By the time dawn blushed the sky, she had reached a lonely stretch of forest. She halted near a narrow stream, letting her horse drink while she ate a piece of dried meat. Her breath formed clouds in the chilly air. She considered where to go next. Should she head to King's Landing, see if the tales of a smuggler king were as honest as claimed? Or make her way further north to see Sansa, or possibly find Jon at the Wall? She felt the old ache in her heart at the thought of home. But Arya was never truly comfortable in halls and keeps anymore. She belonged to the road, the open horizon, the unpredictability of new places. She recalled a rumor she had overheard 2 nights before in another small tavern, a rumor of golden sands and broken alliances in Dorne. Something about the new Prince of Dorne chafing under the constraints of King Davos's treaties. If that sparked a conflict, the realm might see fresh battles in the southern deserts. Arya's curiosity stirred. She'd never seen Dorne in all its glory, only passed near the borders once. Perhaps she would ride south, see it for herself, gather a sense of what might be brewing. Her path had always been one of motion. Yet as she stood by the stream, she felt the faintest tug at her heart, a memory of faces she had once called family. Bran, solemn and far away. Jon, exiled yet steadfast. Sansa, regal and wise. There was love there, under all the changes. She closed her eyes, fighting the urge to turn her horse north at once. Then she recalled the swirl of laughter inside her head from the spirit of her younger self, who once insisted on forging her own path. There was time, perhaps, to see Dorne and then return to Winterfell. She promised herself that she would see them again. But not yet. She was Arya Stark, no one, yet someone, free to walk the roads unbound. She mounted her horse once more, stowing the dried meat. The creature whickered softly, stamping a hoof. Arya stroked its neck. South, then, she said quietly, glancing at the rising sun. Let's see what the desert is like at dawn. With that, she set off at a brisk pace, the clang of her horse's shoes echoing against the half-frozen ground. The north would wait for her, she supposed. It always had. Late autumn turned to early winter. In King's Landing, the crispness of the air gave way to damp chill. Ships crowded the harbor, carrying goods from Dorne, the Vale, even Braavos. Trade was on the rise, fueling the slow restoration of the city. King Davos presided over meetings in the Red Keep, hearing updates from Gendry about the Iron Islands. The master of ships had ventured there, forging a fragile understanding with Yara Greyjoy that her people could raid outside the 6 kingdoms if they dared, but not within them. It was a compromise that felt precarious, but Yara offered her word, a vow Gendry accepted with cautious hope. On one cool morning, Davos was finishing his midday meal, stale bread dipped in broth, when Tyrion hurried into the solar. The hand's expression was tense, his uneven gait more pronounced than usual. Davos set down the bowl, concern etching his brow. What's happened? Davos asked. Tyrion handed him a scroll sealed with a Sun and Spear sigil. From Dorne. The new prince expresses dissatisfaction with the terms of our alliance. He insists upon full autonomy in setting taxes and tariffs for goods passing through the prince's pass, and he wants it codified in writing that the crown will never send forces into Dorne without his explicit invitation. Davos skimmed the letter. That's hardly beyond reason. Dorne has always cherished its independence. It seems he wants to ensure no repeat of the Targaryen or Lannister invasions. Is that all that's bothering you? Tyrion ran a hand through his hair. The tone of the letter suggests deeper unrest. I've heard from my own sources that some Dornish lords are pressing for even greater separation, wanting to follow the North's example and declare full independence. So far, the prince isn't endorsing that, but if he feels we're ignoring his demands, it might push him down that road. Davos leaned back, exhaling. Let me think. If the North is independent, it's not unthinkable that Dorne could be too. But that would break the 6 kingdoms into 5, and who's to say the Vale, the Westerlands, or the Reach won't follow suit? Tyrion's gaze was somber. We'd be fracturing the realm bit by bit until we're little more than a patchwork of petty kingdoms. Some might argue that's better than a realm forcibly held together. But you wanted to keep unity for the sake of trade, mutual protection, and so on. Where do we draw the line? Davos laced his fingers. I don't wish to keep anyone who truly wants to leave, but I fear the ripple effect. Then again, if the Dornish truly want out, can we stop them without war? And I will not wage another war just to keep them forcibly bound. Tyrion nodded slowly. So we must handle this with tact. Perhaps dispatch an envoy, someone well-versed in Dornish customs who can negotiate a settlement that grants them enough autonomy without severing ties. The prince might accept a compromise if it lets him save face among his restless lords. Davos drummed his fingers on the table. You're better at negotiating than I am. But the Dornish have long memories. They might still hold grudges for what happened to Elia Martell, Oberyn Martell, the whole saga. Tyrion's face tightened at the memory of Oberyn's fate. Indeed, but I can attempt it. Or we might send Samwell Tarly. He has a calmer presence. Or even Brienne, she's at least perceived as honorable. But Dornish politics can be labyrinthine. They debated for a while until Davos decided on a plan. He would send an official embassy led by Samwell Tarly with a mix of knights and scribes to show respect without implying force. They would open a formal dialogue to address the prince's concerns, offering concessions on taxation and guaranteeing non-interference unless a crisis demanded it. Meanwhile, Davos would make no statement about the possibility of Dorne declaring full independence. He hoped that by engaging them fairly, they would remain within the realm voluntarily. That very afternoon, Samwell was summoned and given the mission. Though he looked anxious, he recognized the importance of the task and agreed to depart within the fortnight. He would sail from King's Landing to Sunspear, a journey that would test his nerves, for Sam was hardly a seafaring man. Gilly, now his companion and wife in all but name, would stay behind in the city, caring for their little one, content to remain out of harm's way. As evening fell, Davos mulled over the tension in his mind. The North had parted peacefully, largely because Sansa was his ally, and the realm had been exhausted by war. Would Dorne's departure, should it come to that, also be peaceful? Or would forces in the Crownlands or beyond cry out for a show of might to preserve the king's authority? He thought of how precarious the realm had been under the Targaryens, the Baratheons, the Lannisters, always at risk of crumbling under the weight of ambition. The notion of further fragmentation worried him, yet the last thing he wanted was to become a tyrant, forcing unity upon those who did not want it. He let out a weary sigh. Often he envied those with simpler lives, fishermen, farmers, or old sellswords who retired to a quiet plot of land. But the crown on his brow demanded constant vigilance. He looked out the window at the city lights below, the murmur of 1,000 voices rising into the night. All he could do was try to keep his promise to be a king for the people, not for his own glory. Days became weeks, and the tension over Dorne simmered. Samwell's embassy departed, but no swift answers returned. Gendry, having returned from the Iron Islands, busied himself repairing King's Landing's harbor fortifications. Tyrion juggled the realm's finances, which, while improving thanks to resumed trade, still teetered on the brink of debt. Brienne oversaw the training of new guards, determined to rid the city of banditry that had flourished under the chaos. And Davos spent long hours hearing the concerns of lords from the Stormlands, the Vale, and the Reach, all of whom had their own anxieties about the realm's changing shape. Tyrion, perhaps more restless than he let on, took to walking the city streets in disguise, an old habit from his time serving different rulers. One evening, he ventured into Flea Bottom, wearing a threadbare cloak with a hood to hide his recognizable features. Brienne, suspecting his plan, followed at a discreet distance. Tyrion slipped among the narrow alleys, where the stench of sewage mingled with the aroma of cheap stew. Street children darted by, chasing each other with laughter that rang too loud for the gloom surrounding them. Ragged men and women huddled around small fires, warming their hands, trading gossip about the next day's labors. Some recognized Tyrion as a dwarf, but not as the Hand of the King. That was how he wanted it. He paused by a corner where a half-blind old woman sat with a battered cup, begging. Tyrion dropped a few coins into the cup, drawing a grateful mumble. He considered asking her about the scuttlebutt on the streets, but decided she had enough burdens. Moving on, he overheard scraps of conversation, talk of the returning sellswords with no coin left, muttering about the underpinnings of the new regime. Some complained that Daenerys had promised a better world only to vanish in a storm of blood. Others had pinned hopes on Jon Snow only to see him exiled. The name Davos Seaworth garnered mild respect from a few who recalled he was once of the common folk, but others expressed cynicism. Kings always promised more than they delivered, they said. Tyrion sighed, leaning against the rough stone wall of a building that might have once been a modest tavern. Flea Bottom had improved slightly since the worst of the war, fewer corpses in the gutters at least, but the city's poorest districts were always the last to feel any real prosperity. If Davos could truly lift them out of squalor, it would be the first time in living memory a king had done so. Tyrion believed Davos might succeed, given time. But time was a scarce commodity in a land that had known so many upheavals. He heard movement behind him and turned, half expecting a cut purse. Instead, Brienne stepped from the shadows, wearing a long cloak herself. She raised her hands to show she meant no alarm. "Couldn't let you wander alone," she said quietly. "These alleys have eyes." Tyrion brushed off a bit of dirt from his cloak. "I appreciate your diligence, Sir Brienne. I was trying to gauge the mood. It seems cautious, uncertain. People are wary of yet another shift in power." Brienne nodded. "Then we should redouble efforts to show them stability. The king means well, but we must demonstrate action, something tangible these folks can see and feel." "Agreed," Tyrion murmured, mind already racing with ideas. Perhaps a direct initiative to repair housing in Flea Bottom or a food distribution from the crown's surplus. We can't wave a wand and fix centuries of poverty, but we can at least show them we care. A voice from the darkness called out, "Oi, Halfman. Got a coin to spare?" Tyrion tensed, turning to see a gaunt man leaning against the wall, holding out a grimy hand. The man's eyes flicked to Brienne's imposing stature, but did not quail. "Just need some coin for bread, I do," he said with a half slur. Tyrion reached into his pouch, pulling out a pair of copper coins. He handed them over. "This will buy some bread if you don't overspend on ale," he said gently. The man took them with a flash of gratitude, then a wry grin. "Ale's cheaper than bread sometimes," he muttered, staggering away. Brienne watched him go with a thoughtful frown. Tyrion could imagine her thinking that a knight's vow to protect the innocent extended to these streets, but that vow had always been overshadowed by the demands of lords and kings. That was the difference now. Davos was trying, in earnest, to remember the small folk. Tyrion resolved to help him in that endeavor, for if they failed, the cycle of resentment would swirl anew. They departed Flea Bottom, returning to the Red Keep in silence. The city gates at night were guarded by men wearing new tabards that combined Davos's black ship and the stag of Baratheon. They saluted. Tyrion and Brienne climbed the torchlit ramp to the keep's main courtyard. The guards recognized Tyrion now and let him pass without question. Brienne parted ways, heading to check on the watch rotations. Tyrion continued alone to the tower that had become the administrative hub of the realm. He found Davos in a modest office, hunched over a map of Westeros. A single candle illuminated the table, casting dancing shadows. Davos rubbed his forehead, glancing up as Tyrion entered. "Out for a stroll?" Davos asked, voice tinged with fatigue. "Flea Bottom," Tyrion said simply, removing his hood. "People are surviving, but they need more visible support. It might help them trust this new order." Davos nodded, eyes flicking back to the map. "We'll allocate funds for improving some of those houses that burned in the dragon fire. We can't do everything, but small steps. Meanwhile, I'm receiving more letters from various lords about Dorne. Some worry that if Dorne leaves, trade routes south will be disrupted. Others see a chance to exploit the tension. The realm can't afford another war, Tyrion." Tyrion laid a gentle hand on Davos's shoulder. "We'll handle it. Step by step, as you said." Davos inhaled, letting his gaze linger on the map's southern reaches where Dorne was written in curling script. He could almost envision that corner peeling away from the rest. Perhaps that was not the end of the world, but it would complicate the tapestry of alliances. Still, the gravity of the moment weighed on him. So many were counting on him to keep the fragile peace intact. "All right," Davos murmured at last. "We do what we can, and we leave the rest to the gods or to chance." Tyrion allowed a faint smile. "At least you don't claim to be a chosen one. We've had enough of that. Let's keep doing the work quietly and persistently." With that, the two men turned their attention to the next pile of scrolls awaiting them, determined to guide Westeros towards some measure of stability. In the frosty darkness north of the wall, Jon Snow stood beside Tormund on a stark hillside, scanning the plains below. A fierce wind tugged at his cloak. The night sky glittered with distant stars, each a tiny prick of light in the vast blackness. Below, a scattering of torches marked the small free folk settlement they had helped establish near the woods. Smoke from the communal fires drifted upwards, carrying the aroma of roasting game. "How long we staying here?" Tormund asked, folding his massive arms across his chest. Jon let out a soft breath, visible as a cloud. "They want to build a palisade before heavier snows come. A few more days should do it." Tormund nodded, rummaging in a pouch for a piece of dried meat. "I miss the days of pure roaming, no walls, no watch. But I suppose if these folks want some protection, we'll help." Jon understood Tormund's restlessness. The wildling chieftain had never enjoyed the constraints of settlement, but many free folk had grown weary of constant wandering, especially families with small children. A safe perimeter meant they could sleep easier. Jon found it admirable that Tormund stayed anyway, out of loyalty. They descended the slope, stepping carefully among loose stones. Ghost trotted ahead, alert to any movement in the gloom. Jon let his thoughts drift to Winterfell. Word reached him now and then about Sansa's efforts, about the North forging its own destiny. He heard nothing of an impending threat to the realm. The rumors of tension in Dorne had reached even this far. He felt a pang, wondering if his presence might have helped in the south. But then he remembered how the Unsullied and Grey Worm had demanded justice, how his own crime of killing Daenerys Targaryen had forced a compromise. No, he belonged here, in exile, seeing to the quiet tasks that still needed doing. At the foot of the hill, Kovan greeted them with a nod. She had remained with the Watch, finding a surprising sense of purpose aiding the patchwork communities that were forming. She carried a torch that flickered in the wind. "Good timing," she said. "We're about to raise part of the palisade. Could use extra hands?" Tormund grunted. "Fine. Let's get to it then." They made their way among the tents and huts where men and women labored to hoist sharpened timbers upright and pack snow and earth around the bases for support. Children scurried about collecting scraps. Despite the cold and the late hour, the settlement buzzed with determined energy. Jon pitched in, helping lift heavy posts, guiding them into position. Tormund steadied them, bellowing instructions. Time slipped by as they worked under the stars, the physical exertion banishing the chill that threatened to seep into their bones. By the time they drove the last stake and lashed it to the adjacent ones, the night had progressed. Jon wiped sweat from his brow, exhaling a visible gust. The ring of torches around the settlement flickered, casting long shadows. A tall free folk woman named Orla approached, offering a skin of water to Jon. "You do as much work as the rest," she observed. "More than some crows in the old days." Jon accepted the water with a small, tired smile. "I don't mind the labor. It's better than sitting idle." Orla glanced at Ghost, who sat a short distance away, watching the flicker of flames. "That beast of yours wards off trouble. Don't think we've seen a single predator since you arrived." Jon looked at Ghost fondly. "He does that." In the distance, Tormund's loud laughter erupted, apparently sharing a coarse joke with Kovan. Jon felt an odd sense of community here, an acceptance he never quite found among the southern courts. Life was rough, the cold unrelenting, but it felt honest. Perhaps that was enough for him. Still, as he gazed at the newly erected palisade, he thought of the countless walls that men built, both literal and figurative. Jon had broken some in his lifetime, forging unity between the Watch and the Free Folk. Others he failed to break, such as the ancient wheels of power that crushed the common people. He hoped that somewhere, King Davos and Sansa were shaping a realm with fewer invisible walls, fewer divisions. Yet the memory of Daenerys tugged at him, unbidden. She had once spoken of a broken wheel, of a world set free. In the end, she had become the very force of destruction she once swore to end. Jon had stabbed her through the heart. Sometimes he woke with her name on his lips, haunted by her final expression. Perhaps that regret would be his lifelong burden. He tried to bury it in work and the hush of the northern wind, though it found him in the lonely hours. Rubbing his hand over his face, Jon turned away from the palisade. There was more to be done, food to distribute, watch rotations to organize. He set aside personal ghosts, focusing on the living souls who needed him. That he had learned was the only way forward. Months passed, and winter settled over much of Westeros like a silver-white blanket. The sea at Eastwatch by the sea froze in patches, ice floes drifting along the coast. Supply ships from the south sometimes struggled to make docking, but the north had grown adept at storing enough provisions. Sansa's hold on her kingdom tightened in a good way, forging strong alliances with White Harbor, the Bar Rollins, and the Rill. She established traveling courts, a retinue of officials who toured the northern holdings, ensuring that justice was maintained even in remote corners. The small folk appreciated her diligence, and while she faced pockets of resistance, none had the strength or will to challenge her authority seriously. At King's Landing, the climate was milder, though still chilly. The city's reconstruction advanced enough that entire districts once left in ruins now bustled with blacksmiths, bakers, and glassmakers who found a market for their wares. Davos's court hammered out new regulations on trade, ensuring the crown took a fair cut to replenish its coffers without stifling commerce. Ships from Essos occasionally arrived bearing cloth, spices, and even exotic animals. The city began to feel alive again, no longer a smoldering shell. Some called Davos the Fisher King, half in jest, half in respect, for he had once been a smuggler of fish and onions, now dedicating himself to feeding and sustaining an entire realm. Still, tensions simmered in Dorne. Samwell Tarly wrote back that negotiations were cordial but uncertain. The prince welcomed Samwell politely, but behind the scenes, rumors persisted of certain Dornish lords pressing for outright independence. Sam's letters described feasts held in grand Dornish halls, full of spiced wines, citrus fruits, and dancing that went on until dawn, a courtesy extended to a royal envoy. Yet while the prince smiled, Sam sensed an undercurrent of restlessness. He asked for more time, more authority to make concessions. Tyrion and Davos debated how far to go, not wanting to seem weak but also not wanting to be unyielding. Amid this precarious backdrop, word reached King's Landing that a certain hooded traveler had been spotted in the Riverlands, rumored to be Arya Stark. When Tyrion relayed this to Davos, the king found himself oddly relieved, suspecting that if Arya had returned, perhaps it was not to stir trouble but to keep watch on her family's homeland. Davos had always liked the idea of the Starks, people of honor who had endured more trials than most. He told Tyrion they should let her be, not attempt to track her movements. Tyrion agreed, remarking that Arya was better left to her own devices. One late afternoon, Davos took a rare break to walk the walls of the Red Keep. The sky was streaked with the colors of twilight, and from that vantage he could see the entire sprawl of King's Landing, from the crowded streets around the great September's ruins now gradually being rebuilt as a smaller sept, to the glitter of the Blackwater Bay. The city no longer smelled of ash, though the memory of that final dragon attack lingered in many hearts. Davos breathed in the brine of the sea, letting the wind ruffle his hair. He heard footsteps and turned to see Brienne approaching. She bowed her head with a polite, "Your Grace," then joined him in gazing out over the city. "It's looking better," Brienne observed. "Fewer collapsed roofs, more bustling markets." Davos nodded. "Yes. I only hope the progress lasts. We've a tenuous balance in the realm. The Iron Islands, Dorne, and other corners each with their own distinct demands." Brienne folded her hands. "I've served many rulers. Even the best of them carried the seeds of conflict. But you're different, Davos. You understand humility, how to listen. If the realm can't find peace under you, then perhaps it never could." Her words were earnest, and Davos felt a faint flush of gratitude. "I appreciate that, Sir Brienne. I often feel out of my depth. I was a commoner once, you know. Still am, in my bones." She smiled gently. "Perhaps that's the point." They stood there a while longer, letting the hush of the descending night wrap around them. In that moment, it seemed possible that Westeros could leave its darkest days behind. Of course, any number of challenges could unravel everything, but for a time, one could almost believe in the realm's slow healing. Days later, a raven arrived bearing the Prince of Dorne's official reply to Samwell's proposals. In the Red Keep Solar, Tyrion read it aloud to Davos. "To His Grace, King Davos of the Six Kingdoms. We are grateful for the respectful negotiations led by Samwell Tarly, who has shown courtesy and open-mindedness in representing your grace. After much deliberation with our council, we, the Prince of Dorne, wish to affirm our continued membership in the Six Kingdoms, provided the following conditions are ratified. The Crown shall not dispatch any military force into Dornish territory without prior request or consent from the Prince of Dorne. Dorne retains full authority to levy taxes and tariffs on goods passing through the Prince's Pass and the Boneway, with no more than a modest portion to be negotiated contributed to the royal treasury. All future disputes between Dorne and the Crown shall be settled by a dedicated joint council, ensuring Dornish customs are honored. Should these terms be acceptable, we pledge our loyalty and friendship to King Davos Seaworth and vow not to secede from the Six Kingdoms." Tyrion paused, meeting Davos's gaze. "Well," he said, "it seems more than fair, if a bit bold. They're essentially asking for near-complete autonomy in matters of defense and taxation. They'll pay us a fraction, presumably, but they won't break away." Davos leaned back, exhaling through his nose. "If we refuse, we risk pushing them toward independence. If we accept, we preserve the unity in name, though Dorne essentially becomes a near-sovereign entity within the realm. Still better than war, I think." Tyrion nodded. "I agree. The question is whether the other lords will accept it. Some might complain that Dorne is getting special treatment. Let them complain," Davos said quietly. "I'd rather keep the realm from splintering further. And this arrangement might serve as a template for other regions like the Iron Islands, if they press for more autonomy. Frankly, if that leads to peace, I'll not stand in their way. Better we stay together by choice than by force." He paused, then nodded resolutely. "Draft a reply, Tyrion. Accept their terms. Add that we welcome Dornish envoys to the capital anytime they wish. We'll finalize the portion of taxes or tributes they owe. A small smile crept onto Tyrion's lips. King Davos the Accommodator. Let it never be said you thirsted for power. Davos chuckled softly. I only thirst for quiet nights and fewer frightened faces. If giving Dorne its near independence under the crown achieves that, so be it. Tyrion took up a quill, began writing. In that simple act, a new shape of Westeros solidified, a looser confederation of kingdoms, each holding more autonomy than in past centuries. The North was fully separate. The Iron Islands had partial autonomy. Dorne, likewise, was drifting toward a similar status. The Stormlands, the Westerlands, the Vale, and the Reach remained tied more closely to King Davos, largely because they had not yet demanded otherwise. It was a far cry from the Targaryen dream of a single empire forged in fire and blood. But perhaps it was more stable in its own quiet way. Davos signed the reply, affixing his personal seal. Tyrion sent it off with the fastest raven available. Then they sat in comfortable silence, each feeling a hint of relief. One crisis, at least, seemed headed for resolution. The resolution with Dorne rippled across Westeros. Some lords grumbled, others breathed easy. Markets stabilized, anticipating fresh shipments of Dornish wines and exotic spices. The Prince of Dorne, for his part, held a lavish ceremony in Sunspear, formally pledging loyalty to Davos while reading the newly minted terms. Samwell Tarly wrote back with relief, no bloodshed, no secession. Only an agreement that gave Dorne room to breathe. In Winterfell, Sansa received a raven informing her of the crown's agreement with Dorne. She found herself surprisingly pleased. Though she had no direct stake in the matter, her north stood separate. She wanted the realm to avoid another war. Perhaps she felt a lingering bond with the South, or simply empathy for those who would have suffered. She had endured enough bloodshed to last 10 lifetimes. When she announced the news in her hall, most Northerners shrugged. Dorne was far away and they had their own concerns. A few expressed relief, if only to confirm that no Southern armies would be marching north anytime soon. That same day, Sansa strolled through the Godwood of Winterfell, seeking a moment of tranquility. The heart tree stood in silent vigil, red leaves rustling in the breeze. She pressed her palm to its trunk, remembering how her brother Bran often sat here, quiet as a spirit, before he became the three-eyed raven. She sometimes whispered her thoughts to the old gods, though she was never quite sure if they answered. On this occasion, she spoke softly about her hopes that the realm would truly heal, that Jon would find some measure of peace, that Arya was safe wherever she roamed, and that Bran, in his infinite watchfulness, might find contentment. She stayed until the chill sank into her bones, then returned to the castle. Her steward awaited her with news that a small caravan had arrived, traders from White Harbor bringing salt fish and textiles. Sansa went to greet them personally, her posture regal yet welcoming. This was the shape of her life now, the tasks of ruling, the constant vigilance for her people's well-being, the forging of alliances with honest courtesy. She thought of how naive she had once been, dreaming of knights and songs. Now, she was living something altogether more complicated, but in many ways more real. As she spoke with the traders, hearing their updates on White Harbor's bustling docks, she felt a faint stir of satisfaction. The North was alive, strong, and free. If winter storms came fiercely, they would endure as they always had. If the southern kingdoms had found a measure of peace, so much the better. And if ever they needed to stand together again, against an external threat or a shared crisis, she believed they could. For all the heartbreak and violence, a cautious hope had taken root in Westeros like green shoots pushing through the snow. On a crisp, clear dawn, Bran Stark appeared at the edge of the haunted forest, near a circle of ancient weirwood trees, or so the free folk would later say. Some swore they saw him roll silently across the snow in his wheeled chair, though no tracks led to or from that spot. Others claimed he vanished among ravens, his body dissolving into the swirling black flock. Rumors of his sightings had become part of northern lore, impossible to verify. Yet Jon Snow, returning from a distant patrol, found him waiting near Castle Blacksgate, as if guided by an otherworldly sense of timing. Jon had dismounted, handing his mare to a stable hand when he saw Bran, hooded, eyes distant, a quiet figure. Jon froze, heart pounding. He approached slowly, Ghost at his side. Bran looked up, that calm, timeless expression unsettling in its serenity. Bran, Jon said quietly, feeling an inexplicable urge to kneel or show deference. He fought it though. You're here. Bran inclined his head. I heard the wind calling, so I came. Jon glanced at the wall behind Bran, the battered gate, the swirling gusts of snow. How did you travel? A faint smile touched Bran's lips. The same way ravens do. He gazed at the fortress, the old towers and parapets. It's changed, but it still stands. Jon swallowed, feeling a torrent of emotions. I didn't think I'd see you again. Sansa wrote that you wandered, that you refused the throne. He paused, searching for words. I understand why. Bran's gaze flickered. Do you? Jon nodded slowly. Yes. It wasn't your place, was it? You're above such things now. A mild sadness colored Bran's voice. I am not above. I am simply apart. I have seen the shapes of history and the echoes of times yet to come. A king must live among his people in the present, forging bonds. Cannot do that. My duty is memory. Jon breathed out, a plume of white in the air. Then you're fulfilling it in your own way? Bran's eyes shone with something distant and unfathomable. Yes, I have watched you, Jon. You carry guilt and grief, but also compassion. You saved countless lives. The realm is on a path to healing. Davos leads with humility. Sansa rules the north with wisdom, and you guard the edges of the world. Perhaps that is how it must be. For now. Jon bowed his head. The mention of his guilt cut deep, but he could not deny it. He forced himself to meet Bran's gaze. Will you stay? Can I talk with you as we once did? Bran's expression softened. I will stay for a short while. I'd like to see the old library, if it still stands. Share a meal with you. Then I must go again. Jon found his chest tight with gratitude. Of course. We'll see that you have a room and anything else you need. Bran nodded. Thank you. They moved inside Castle Black, the Black brothers gaping at Bran's appearance but bowing respectfully all the same. Tormund watched with curiosity, muttering that Bran had the eyes of a man who'd seen more than any living soul. Kovan hovered, uncertain whether to address him as my lord or something else. Bran drifted through the corridors, as though following a memory of them from his youth. Jon walked alongside, occasionally pointing out changes or repairs. They reached the library, a cramped chamber with shelves of old tomes and scrolls. Bran's fingers brushed across the spines of books, some half-rotted with age, others brand new, donated by Samwell before he left for King's Landing. In a quiet moment, Bran turned to Jon. You wonder if you did right, taking her life, he said softly. Though Jon had not spoken Daenerys's name, Jon's breath halted. Yes, I wonder every day. Bran rested a hand on the arm of his wheeled chair. You ended one path of fire and blood, allowing another path to emerge, one with fewer chains for the realm. I have seen many branches of the future. In most of them, the city burns again. More innocents die. Your choice spared thousands, perhaps tens of thousands. That does not lessen your sorrow, but know that it was necessary. Tears threatened Jon's composure, but he fought them back. He bowed his head. Thank you. Bran's voice was quiet. You may never find peace in that act, but it enabled peace for the realm. Sometimes our burdens are not for ourselves but for others. They said nothing more on the subject. The hush of the library filled the space between them. After a time, Bran selected a battered tome, an old chronicle of the Night's Watch. Jon found them a place by the hearth, where they spoke of simpler things. Jon described the free folk settlements, Tormund's antics, the day-to-day routine. Bran listened with a faint smile, though Jon sensed a deeper current behind those pale eyes, as if Bran existed both in that room and in 1,000 other points in time. That evening, they shared a meal of stew and bread in the castle's main hall. Bran ate sparingly, pausing often as though lost in reverie. Tormund tried to banter with him, but found the conversation odd. Kovan offered quiet politeness. At length, the meal ended, and Bran excused himself to rest. Jon escorted him to a small chamber that had been hastily prepared, ensuring the fire was lit. Bran thanked him and wheeled inside. Jon lingered in the corridor, heart heavy yet strangely uplifted. Seeing Bran, speaking with him had rekindled something in Jon. A sense that no matter how fractured the past, there was a thread of connection between them all. Perhaps that was enough to shoulder his burdens a while longer. The next morning, Jon woke to find Bran gone. He had vanished as quietly as he had appeared, leaving no tracks. A single raven perched on the windowsill of Jon's quarters, watching him with uncanny stillness. Then it flew off into the ashen sky. Jon stood there, feeling a faint ache of loss, but also a spark of understanding. Bran was a wanderer now, untethered to any one place, living memory incarnate. Jon murmured under his breath, "Farewell, brother," and turned to face another day, the chill of the far north pressing against the walls, but no longer quite as cold in his heart. Winter's grip held Westeros in its usual thrall for long months, then gradually loosened in the south as the sun grew stronger. The roads became muddy, the rivers swelled with meltwater, and new sprouts broke the dark earth in the farmlands near King's Landing. In the midst of that shifting season, a hush settled on the Red Keep. Word reached Davos that the Iron Bank of Bravos was extending new lines of credit, trusting the realm's stability. That was a small but vital victory, an endorsement from the most influential financial power across the Narrow Sea. If the Iron Bank believed Westeros was stable enough, it meant the kingdom could truly begin to prosper. One day, an elaborately dressed envoy from the Iron Bank arrived at the court. A slender man with a carefully trimmed beard, wearing velvet robes, presented himself before King Davos, bowing with exaggerated courtesy. Davos, seated on his unpretentious wooden throne, nodded in greeting, feeling a flicker of apprehension. He knew the Iron Bank could be as dangerous as any army if crossed. "Your Grace," the banker said in a voice as smooth as silk, "we are pleased to witness the peace and reconstruction in your kingdom. We come offering favorable terms for a new loan to complete the rebuilding of key infrastructure. The Crown has earned the goodwill of the bank through prompt repayments thus far." Tyrion, standing at Davos's side, smirked slightly. He had heard that line before. Favorable terms always came with complexities. Davos cleared his throat. "We appreciate the Iron Bank's trust, yet we must be cautious. Our realm is weary of debts that weigh heavily on the small folk. What exactly do you propose?" The envoy unfolded a parchment and began outlining interest rates, payment schedules, and the possibility of Bravosi engineers aiding in the construction of new roads and aqueducts. The terms were indeed less extortionate than they might have been under previous reigns. Perhaps the bank truly saw an advantage in helping Westeros flourish, or perhaps it simply wanted to secure a stable partner. Regardless, Davos listened carefully, glancing to Tyrion for subtle nods or shakes of the head. In the end, they agreed in principle, with final details to be hammered out over the coming weeks. The envoy bowed and took his leave, heading to guest chambers. Once gone, Davos let out a sigh of relief. Tyrion clapped him on the shoulder. "You see? Even the Iron Bank is betting on your success. That bodes well." Davos chuckled ruefully. "Or it means they see a profit to be made. Still, if it helps us rebuild, I can't complain." They conferred on how best to allocate any incoming funds. Tyrion proposed establishing new granaries along the Rose Road, ensuring that surplus harvests from the Reach could be stored and distributed in times of need. Brienne had argued for better roads to the Stormlands to facilitate trade and the movement of the king's men if trouble arose. Gendry wanted shipyards in the Blackwater to craft a modern fleet, ensuring they kept pace with the Ironborn and any potential external threats. Davos realized, with a flicker of wonder, that they were discussing improvements instead of war campaigns. The conversation was about building something rather than tearing something down. It felt like fresh air after years of choking smoke. Outside, the city's bells told me. Day. Sunlight streamed through the windows, illuminating motes of dust in the air. Davos gazed at the scattered parchments on the table, each representing a piece of a realm that was slowly knitting itself back together. He thought of the North, free yet still friendly, of Dorne, content under its special status, of the Iron Islands, precariously satisfied under Yara's leadership. For the first time in a long while, Westeros was not on the brink of catastrophe. It was simply living. And so the years moved on. A hush replaced the once deafening roars of dragons, a patchwork of alliances replaced the iron grip of a single monarchy. Though not perfect, it was better than anything the realm had known in decades. People tilled the fields, built homes, had children, and told stories of the times when winter nearly devoured them all, of how a three-eyed raven refused a throne and instead entrusted it to a smuggler who wore a crown with reluctance. They spoke of how a Stark queen ruled the North, neither overshadowed by southern claims nor forgotten by the realms beyond. Of how a man once named king in the North stood guard beyond the wall, ensuring no creeping horror would threaten their future. All of it flowed from that moment in the Dragonette when Bran Stark uttered a single quiet refusal that shifted the fate of Westeros. Those who had gathered that day would later tell their children and grandchildren it was the strangest council ever held, the moment when prophecy and ambition broke against the simple will of a boy who had seen too much to crave power. And in that refusal, a new age was born, not a golden age, nor one free of strife, but one in which humble men and women might shape their world with mercy and honest labor rather than endless conquest. That was enough for most. The songs sung by bards in taverns spoke less of heroic battles and more of second chances, of battered cities rising from the ashes, of improbable kings who listened to the common folk, and of the cold winds that no longer brought the dead in their wake. In Winterfell's Godwood, Sansa Stark would sometimes pause in her daily routine to look up through the red leaves, letting the hush of ancient trees remind her of her father's legacy. In King's Landing, Davos Seaworth stood on the balcony of the Red Keep each morning, feeling the sun warm the stones where once there was only fear and ruin. In the far north, Jon Snow gazed upon the horizon from atop the wall, Ghost by his side, letting the wind carry away regrets, tethering him to his quiet purpose. And somewhere in the uncharted corners of the world, Arya Stark ventured further, free as the hawk she always yearned to be, while Bran Stark drifted across realms of memory, ensuring the living would never forget the price of the past. Thus, a hush of tentative peace lay over the Seven Kingdoms. Now 6 in union, 1 apart, and all bound by the gentle promise that perhaps, at last, they had learned enough from their mistakes to shape a kinder future. And if shadows of old grudges flickered at the edges, they did not yet gather enough strength to break that hope. Indeed, what began with a single no in the dragon pit became a resounding yes to the possibility that Westeros could heal without another wave of fire and blood. For a land haunted by centuries of turmoil, that possibility glimmered like a long-lost dawn.